In June of 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin accompanied his family on a camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a mountain range rising along the Tennessee-North Carolina border in the southeastern United States. The name Great Smoky Mountains comes from the natural fog that often hangs over the range, appearing as large smoke plumes from a distance. Interestingly, this fog is caused by chemicals emitted from the local flora, chemicals that have a high vapor pressure and easily form vapors at normal temperature and pressures. Yet even having heard the scientific explanation behind the phenomenon, seeing all that fog clinging to the hilltops is a very eerie sight indeed. Hailing from nearby Knoxville, Tennessee, the Martin family had a long-running tradition of celebrating Father's Day by taking camping trips to the Great Smoky Mountains. And 1969 would mark young Dennis's first trip into the woods, in the company of his father, older brother, and grandpa. The group drove out to Cades Cove, an isolated valley located in the Tennessee section of the park, then hiked out towards Russell Field, where they set up camping and began preparing for their first night under the stars. The following morning, they set off for a place known as Spencefield, a picturesque highland meadow and popular camping spot, which was bisected by the rolling hills and jagged mountain peaks of the Appalachian Trail. When the group arrived at Spencefield, Dennis and his older brother set off to explore the campsite, and reportedly talked to many of the other campers who had pitched their tents nearby. This is how they got talking to a ragtag group made up of other campers' children who made fast friends with the Martin boys. Dennis' father was pleased to see his son getting along so well with the other kids, and having his sons occupied meant the adults could get on with the important task of assembling their 4-man tent. Once the task was completed, Dennis was still playing with a group of other kids, and his father says he watched as the group gleefully took up hiding positions from which to playfully ambush a group of approaching adults. When the grown-ups entered the kids' make-believe kill zone, they all jumped out, growling and roaring like wild animals as they set upon their laughing parents. All but one. All but little Dennis. His father watched with growing concern as the seconds ticked by, and Dennis had yet to emerge from his hiding spot. Eventually, he couldn't bear it anymore, and after rising from his camping chair, Dennis's father marched off to the spot where he had last seen his 6-year-old son and began calling out his name. But what started out as stern, fatherly commands soon degenerated into terrified pleas, and as he continued to call out in desperation, the other families began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Once Dennis's grandpa knew he was missing, he set the group into action, sending one group 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail with his son, while he led another group back towards the Cades Cove Ranger Station, arriving there around 8:30 p.m. that night. Thus began an extensive, well-publicized search and rescue operation, in which National Park Service personnel was supplemented by National Guard soldiers and even a unit of Green Berets. At the peak of the search operation, more than 1,400 people were operating in the few square miles around Spencefield, but not a single one found anything that could lead them to the missing boy. However, in the aftermath of the operation, the search efforts drew a great deal of criticism from search and rescue experts far and wide, who said the large number of personnel involved potentially obscuring tracks in ground that was already difficult to track over due to heavy rain. Shockingly, a shoe print belonging to that of a child was actually found at one point, but the track was dismissed as belonging to one of the Boy Scouts that was helping with the search. Later, however, investigators kicked themselves when they found that the tracks were determined to have come from a child who was missing one shoe, which disappeared on the banks of a stream. Some suggesting it was possible that the tracks belonged to Martin, and this theory was supported when a discarded child-sized shoe and sock were found just 3 days later. Although search and rescue personnel continued their search for more than 2 weeks, scouring the hillsides night and day in continual shifts, no further clues to Martin's whereabouts were ever found. The Martin family was so understandably desperate for answers that they offered a $5,000 reward for any information that would reunite them with their beloved Dennis. This got the attention of a handful of so-called psychics, who some might argue sought to exploit the Martin family's grief and maybe cashing in if they guessed the right area of the Smokies to search. Surprisingly, none of these psychics ever proved to be of any help. Many years later, in 1985, a man who had apparently been illegally collecting American ginseng in the park claimed to have come across the skeletal remains of a child while exploring the woods. The man said he should have reported the find, but was terrified of being prosecuted for his prohibited herbal hobby. Not only that, but he was also unable to point investigators in the direction of the site he'd found the bones in the first place. There have been many theories that have attempted to explain what happened to young Dennis Martin that day. Most detectives, both amateur and professional, believe that Dennis became disoriented whilst looking for a hiding place, maybe even forgetting his way back to camp when he emerged from it. Either way, Dennis then strayed further from the camp and could easily have fallen down one of the many steep slopes and ravines that dotted the area surrounding Spencefield. However, Dennis was wearing a bright red t-shirt when he went missing, not something that would be easy for search and rescue teams to miss. Dennis would have to be completely covered in foliage to remain undetected with that color of shirt, and despite it being feasible due to his small size, the likelihood of that is extremely low. Others are quick to remind us of the presence of black bears in the area, as well as copperhead vipers and feral pigs, all of which would have posed a considerable threat to 6-year-old Martin. Park rangers told investigating police that an underweight bear had been caught in a boar trap in the Spencefield area just 2 weeks earlier. Although the bear was released safely, the incident suggested that it may have been struggling to find enough food, prompting to turn to a less familiar source of food. Yet, however tragic and brutal the aforementioned theories are, Dennis's father believes something considerably more sinister. Based on the eyewitness account of one Harold Key, who says he heard a loud scream on the very same afternoon that Dennis disappeared, Dennis's dad firmly believed that his son was kidnapped by an opportunistic predator. Shortly after he heard the scream, Harold Key claimed to have seen a disheveled, bearded man with wild, unkempt hair fleeing through the woods in an apparent bid to remain undetected by the nearby campers. Harold's family went on to explain that they saw a flash of red on the figure's shoulders, which some believe was actually Dennis himself, slung over the shoulder of this mysterious figure as they carried him away. Harold later speculated that the man may have been a moonshiner, explaining his reluctance to be seen. Despite the report, FBI investigators ultimately dismissed it, saying that as much as Harold meant well, his account was frankly unreliable as his timeline of events were off. But one retired park ranger lamented the failure to properly follow up either the footprints or the sighting of the rough-looking man, arguing that as the location of the sighting was downhill from where Dennis disappeared, it was possible to cover that distance in the time frame, even carrying a child, but that the individual in question would have some impressive strength, stealth, and endurance. So if this is the case, who is this hairy mystery man? This bearded vagrant who was apparently capable of such an impressive physical feat, even if it was in the context of the despicable abduction of a child. Given the lack of investigation into his sighting or his tracks, it seems we might never know. But even if we did get to the bottom of the mystery of a man living in the Appalachian Mountains with a penchant for kidnapping children, I don't think the answers would bring us any solace. Maybe the closure would be worth it, especially for the family, but nightmares can be a high price to pay, and wondering what happened to young Dennis Martin can give even the most hardened true crime reader some very sleepless nights. Established in 1908 by Theodore Roosevelt, the Big South Trail is an 11-mile hiking route that winds through the rugged Comanche Peak wilderness into Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. Experienced hikers have described the Big South Trail as of average difficulty, but as one said, there are some areas where the ledges were only 24 inches wide. It can be really tough, and if you're not in shape, it'll take a lot out of you. Known for its picturesque beauty, the trail is also something of a wildlife haven and is home to elk, bobcats, black bears, and mountain lions, just to name a few. While average temperatures on the trail range from highs in the upper 60s in the summer to frigid lows of 10 to 15 degrees in the winter, making it perfect for both sunny and snowy outdoor activities. The area's wild natural beauty is partly what motivated brothers Alan and Arland Atadero to found the Pudra River Resort, a place for hikers and outdoorsmen of every variety to indulge in their hobby of choice. Alan mentioned that he and his brothers spent so much time there that they felt that they were becoming part of the landscape itself. So in the end, it just made sense to move their families out there. Life at the resort was relatively carefree until the fall of 1999, when a Christian singles group was helping Alan prepare for winter in exchange for free lodging. On October 2nd, the Christian singles group decided that they wanted to go visit a nearby trout farm just short of 2 miles from the resort itself. Alan knew several of the singles group well, and since his 6-year-old daughter Jocelyn wanted to join them, Alan knew that there was no way that he could give her permission without her 3-year-old brother Jared wanting to tag along. So, since he trusted the singles group, Alan gave them permission to take his kids with them on their hike at about 10 o'clock that morning. Excited to be on one of his first real outdoor adventures, Jared would keep on running ahead of the group, but no more than about 100 feet before his guardians in the singles group would call him back. At around 11:30, the group stopped to talk to some fishermen that their little Boy Scout had run into while on point, and after a brief conversation, they continued on down the trail. By this time, the group had begun to separate or spread out as they walked. Some people faster and some slower, with at least one adult with Jared's sister and Jared, who continuously ran ahead of everybody else. Shortly afterward, little Jared rounded a corner on the trail and disappeared from view. Technically, he was no further ahead than he usually was, so his guardians didn't worry too much. But when they too rounded the corner, there was no sign of him in the little beige coat he was wearing. One of the singles groups rushed ahead to try to find the boy, but he was nowhere to be found. And as it turned out, that last image of young Jared turning the blind corner on the trail was the last time anyone would see him alive. Over the following few days, a huge search and rescue operation was mounted, but not a single sign of Jared Atadero was found. In fact, it would take almost 4 years for any clues of his demise to be found, but these clues seemed to only raise many more questions than they answered. After searching for approximately an hour, a few members of the hiking group rushed back to the Pudra River Resort to give Alan the bad news that his 3-year-old son was lost in the woods. In a panic, Alan immediately drives out to meet the rest of the group, helping them continue to search for another hour or so. It is during this time that some of the 11-person hiking party say that they heard some kind of high-pitched scream, including Alan's 6-year-old daughter, Jocelyn. I asked her what kind of scream it was, like somebody getting attacked or somebody playing with someone, Alan later said. She said it sounded like a playful scream, as if someone was going up to tag him. Since it seemed like Jared was within earshot, the group continued to search intensively for him, but no matter how hard they tried, they just couldn't locate their lost toddler. So just before 4 o'clock that afternoon, Alan rushed back to the resort to call 911. Less than 30 minutes later, Larimer County Emergency Service Specialist Bill Nelson receives an emergency pager alert, informing them that a child had gone missing on the Big South Trail. In turn, Bill contacts his search and rescue manager, who immediately musters multiple SAR teams to prepare for a large but delicate operation. Within 2 hours of the original 911 call being made, search and rescue personnel had boots on the ground at the lower Big South trailhead, with a total of 65 people involved in the search for Jared. An hour and a half into their search, rescue personnel had scoured the majority of the trail and still hadn't located Jared. As a result, the area of operations was vastly expanded, with reinforcements including Air Force helicopters due to arrive the following morning. At 7 a.m. on October 2nd of 1999, a Cheyenne-based UH-1N Huey helicopter made its first pass over the Big South Trail and remained the search and rescue team's eye in the sky until late in the morning. After returning to Fort Collins Loveland Municipal Airport to refuel, the helicopter arrived back in the search area at around 3:30 that afternoon. However, during its second patrol over the trail, the helicopter struggled with the mountain conditions and stalled out, plummeting more than 100 feet before smashing through the pine canopy near the trailhead. Aboard the Huey were 4 USAF servicemen, but also a representative of the Larimer County Search and Rescue Team named Mark Sheets. When it crashed, Mark was the only passenger who was not securely in a seat, as he was on the floor with the door open. He said that when he saw the rotors hit the top of the trees and pieces of helicopters sprayed into the forest, he rushed to close the door, but a severed tree limb found its way into the hold and struck the Air Force doctor on board squarely in the face, fracturing the doctor's eye socket and causing blood to pour from an open wound. By some stroke of good luck, the Air Force crew was able to escape from the helicopter's wreckage, but Mark Sheets had been completely knocked out cold and was still trapped in the mass of crumbled metal that was still in danger of exploding. Nearby search and rescue members ran to the downed helicopter, smashed in a window, and managed to pull the unconscious Sheets out before he could come to any more harm. But he had still received a severe concussion and a 13-inch L-shaped gash that left his femur exposed. Mark had also suffered 3 broken vertebrae in his lower back and a broken shoulder, possibly from being pulled from the wreckage so violently. The helicopter crash most definitely set the search back a great deal, but thankfully, all survived, and the search efforts continued into their 3rd day. Day 3 saw the arrival of specially trained police diving teams who explored the deep pools of the nearby Poudre River. Another helicopter was dispatched to aid the search, but encountered swirling winds that required full power to prevent crashing. This burned through the chopper's fuel supplies in no time, and it was soon forced to return to Fort Collins Air Force Base. Over the next 3 days, well-meaning but ill-equipped volunteers started hounding the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and Larimer County Search and Rescue to allow them to help. 3-year-old Jared had been missing for almost a week at that point, and time was running out to find him safely. They approved, and soon the number of search and rescue personnel had swelled to over 200 and included a dozen dog teams, professional trackers, a dive team, and a search plane. But even with all those bodies and assets, the search and rescue operation was a complete and utter failure, as not a single usable clue to Jared's whereabouts are found. Consequently, officials are forced to notify the Atadero family that the search for Jared had been suspended. Larimer County Undersheriff Bill Nelson hastily convened a press conference. In it, he told the gathered journalists, "We worked for 8 solid days to begin with, and that was 24 hours a day for 8 days. We did some night searching. It was limited to a certain extent, but we did always have people out in the field to make noise, so if somebody was out there now, Jared would have heard it. He would have maybe responded." Jane Shmievsky, a member of the Larimer County Search and Rescue Canine Unit, said that the search was one of the most intense she'd ever taken part of. She'd never been involved in the search for a child before, and although it was to be expected, she was astounded at the level of media coverage. It became a real nationwide episode, she said. So that put a lot of stress on us, and a lot of stress on the dogs. County Sheriff Justin Smith was just a lowly sergeant back in 1999 when Jared went missing. He said the helicopter crash was an extremely stressful event, which most definitely had a negative effect at a crucial period of the search, and that the intense media interest only exacerbated the situation. It's worth noting that this all took place right around the time that the grand jury of the Jean-Benet Ramsey case was due to hand down indictments, so the concept of children coming to harm loomed large in the national zeitgeist. Naturally, the media flocked to sate the public's appetite for answers, and at one point, 17 TV satellite trucks lined Colorado's Highway 14, and the area swarmed with reporters and camera crews, sporting fur coats to protect them from the bitter Colorado cold. Meanwhile, police information hotlines were buzzing with calls, including a number of self-proclaimed psychics who claimed they knew where SAR operators could find the terrified but still living Jared. TV crews observed a Native American medicine man visiting the area, who informed them he had arrived to perform a kind of ritual in which he would ask the mountain to return the boy to his parents. And in one particularly unusual but wholesome incident, a barefoot man with a mule showed up on the trail and volunteered his services in the search effort. But as much as the gesture was a heartfelt one, Dog teams and aircraft had failed to find any sign of Jared, so one more pair of eyes on the ground proved of little use. As much as it hurt them to do so, rescue volunteers were forced to call off their search entirely, and for years, the case of little Jared's disappearance remained a complete and utter mystery. Cut to June of 2003, when hikers Rob Osborne and Gareth Watts were making their visit to the Big South Trail. "We singled out the Poudre Canyon as an area we'd like to explore," Rob said, "so we decided on getting there via the Big South Trail. We'd heard how gorgeous a hike it was, how beautiful and wild the area around the river was, and since that's the whole reason Gary and I got into hiking, we figured we'd pay it a visit." While on their hike, Rob and Gareth wound up in a rock field and decided to hike up around 2,000 feet to reach its top. "It's remarkable country up there, but it really was a scramble," Gareth later said. "You're constantly watching your feet. Focus on the area in front of you so you don't end up twisting an ankle or something." He and Rob had hiked areas in the vicinity before and were obviously aware of the Jared Atadero mystery owing to the amount of media attention it received. And, as experienced outdoorsmen, they had spent one or two occasions theorizing on the cause of the boy's disappearance. "We'd figured he'd been swept downstream, maybe taken by a mountain lion," Rob said. "Obviously, there was the possibility of something more sinister happening, but it's something we didn't really talk about. Having kids of our own, it just didn't bear thinking about." But since they were hiking the exact area that Jared had gone missing, the pair felt an eerie sense of dread and couldn't keep their minds off the mysterious and heartbreaking incident. But neither must have expected the discovery they were due to make that day. Rob and Gareth usually stuck to popular hiking trails, mainly for safety purposes. But on that first visit to the Big South Trail, with the thought of Jared's disappearance in their minds, they took it upon themselves to wander off the trail. "We didn't set out to find anything," Gareth added. "We figured if a whole team of guys couldn't find anything, there was no way we could. But I guess there was an element of what if, you know." Then about an hour into the hike, we just walked right into it. I couldn't believe my eyes at first. But there they were, clear as day. Rob and Gareth had somehow stumbled across a set of child's clothes, more than 500 feet up the trail from where he was last seen. "That's when I saw the shoe," Gareth said. "It was a kid's shoe, definitely, and it was pristine, like somebody had just took their foot right out of it, you know? Fresh, like you might look up and see a kid hopping around looking for their sneaker." But then, the two hiking buddies found another matching shoe, a brown fleece jacket and a pair of blue sweatpants that had been turned inside out. In their eyes, there was no way these clothes could be Jared Atadero's. The boy had been missing almost 4 years by that time, and it wasn't conceivable that they could be exposed to elements for all this time. It still looked brand new. But still, just in case, the two men took photographs of the clothes and called 911 at the next available opportunity. They complied with the detective's request to email over the photographs they'd taken, which were then forwarded to Alan Atadero, who was living in Littleton at the time. The detective was stunned when he received a reply stating that the clothes did indeed belong to Jared. Within 24 hours, state authorities had assembled a team consisting of Larimer County Sheriff's Office members, Larimer County Search and Rescue officials, rangers from the Colorado Division of Wildlife, and volunteers from an organization known as NecroSearch. All were directed to meet at Big South Trailhead to start search for remains of Jared. Later, with Alan Atadero and personnel from the local Child Protection Network joining the search effort, they managed to recover the remains of the entire outfit that Jared was wearing on the day of his disappearance, which were scattered over a 25-foot area. While the cloth jacket had what appeared to be puncture marks and the pants were tattered, the nylon shoes had little weathering, leading investigators to conclude that some of the items were sheltered from the elements and some were exposed. It was the simplest explanation, but not necessarily the correct one. Then, at a site at about 180 feet north and 20 feet higher in elevation than the place the clothing was found, police made a chilling discovery. It was a tiny piece of a human being's skull, wedged into a crevice and only barely visible with the naked eye. Nearby, on a log spanning the crevice where the skull fragment was found, police also found a human tooth. At 5 p.m. that evening, Alan Atadero and other members of the search teams summoned the throngs of TV news reporters to the trailhead and announced what he and the team had found. It was most definitely a breakthrough in the case, but again, the discovery only seemed to generate more questions than it answered, and it wasn't long before people were forced to come up with their own explanations. Canadian outdoorsman Les Survivor Man Shroud said that whatever is happening up on the Big South Trail is simply beyond human comprehension. In a lot of these cases, search and rescue or the volunteers searching people have already gone over certain areas, not once, not twice, but even dozens of times, he said. And then the child is found there maybe a year, maybe a few years later. It makes no sense at all. I've been out in the woods for years now, and I've seen all kinds of things, but still, I can't make sense of it all. Hiker Rob Osborne says there's a good chance the area where Jared's clothes were found wasn't searched during the initial effort, and that it was down to one simple thing. No way could a kid have climbed up to that spot on his own. No way. I mean, it was a struggle for Gary and I to get there. It was very rough terrain, so maybe the police should have searched that area the first time around, but at the same time, I can't blame them for rolling it out. Police dog handler Jane Schmievsky's conclusion from the get-go was that Jared's disappearance was due to an animal encounter. I'm not sure officially what has really been released as a finality, but it pretty much points to an animal encounter. Nothing else explains how he could have been dragged up so high, unless of course it was a person that took Jared that morning. This was where SAR specialist Bill Nelson's testimony gets a little frightening. If a big cat actually took him, which is what I believe happened, it would have taken him someplace and buried him, he said. With all the activity that was going on, we probably scared it away. Then it would have come back later to dig up its meal. That's why no one found nothing. The kid was underground the whole time. But then surely volunteers or police would have noticed some disturbed earth somewhere, and Jared's clothing must have showed some signs of animal attack. It's inconsistencies like those that make Alan Atadero think something else is to blame for his son's disappearance. I hear constantly about a mountain lion, he said, but when they tested Jared's clothes, there was no mountain lion hairs, no DNA, no blood, nothing on his clothes. If a mountain lion would have attacked him, they would have gone for the stomach area. His jacket would have been threads, but his jacket was fine. I've talked to wildlife experts about this, Alan said, quick to reassure those who will listen. Jared's jacket would not have survived a mountain lion attack. His shoes that were found up in the mountain, as told by investigators, do not look like they were in the wilderness for years. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Alan also notes that the other thing interesting about the discovery of Jared's almost spotless shoes is that they would most definitely have been scuffed up if he had been dragged up the side of the mountain, a la mountain lion attack. His pants were found in good condition with only minor damage from rodents and birds using threads for nesting materials. A large predator would have had to tear through the small boy's clothing in order to feed, yet there's no signs that that was the case. One of the reports that Alan Atadero read says that the reason why that forensic examiners didn't find any DNA or blood on Jared's clothing is because either he or something removed his clothes before he was attacked. We can only imagine how horrified his father would have been reading that. That was the very last thing he wanted to hear. The report goes on to say that because there were so many hikers coming up, the mountain lion that took Alan's son then absconded with his body 500 feet up the side of the cliff. Yet the question remains, if something took Jared's clothing off before he was attacked, why was it then found around 500 feet up the mountainside? His pants were found inside out, a clear indication that they had been pulled off in a hurry and not by anything that had claws or teeth. And as we've said, it's little details like this that cause Alan and his family to believe that someone out there knows a little more about the case than they're comfortable sharing. Jared's disappearance has never been fully explained by either U.S. law enforcement or their amateur counterparts. But it's important for mountain lion theorists to keep this in mind that since 1915, there have been a grand total of 14 reported mountain lion attacks in the US and Canada that have resulted in fatality. The chances of being attacked by one are tremendously low, and even lower when you consider that Jared was part of a large group of hikers. These hikers were intensively questioned by the police, as it seemed natural that at least one of them would be held responsible for his disappearance. But multiple homicide detectives said interviews with hiking group members showed no obvious red flags, and that no evidence pointed toward their guilt. As a result of such speculation, theories seeking to explain such mysterious events have evolved from purely rational possibilities to bizarre, conspiracy theory-like explanations, such as cryptid attacks or alien abduction. But as much as people keep throwing ideas at the wall, nothing is sticking, and as more and more time goes by, it looks more and more likely that the disappearance of young Jared Hatadero will forever remain a heartbreaking but terrifying mystery.
This took place 2 years ago, and I can still recall every moment in almost perfect detail. It was nearing the end of school. Everyone was on their way to their last period, which for me was history, a class that I not only wasn't good at, but I also disliked the teacher, and at that point I honestly had no motivation of even showing up. So, ultimately, I decided to ditch and hide out in one of the bathroom stalls located near the very back of the school. Almost no one went back there, so I figured no one would find out anyway. I was in the furthest back stall, playing some game on my phone, when the ear-deafening sound of the principal coming over the intercom made me jump.
Lockdown, lockdown. This is an emergency alert. Please follow lockdown procedures. Go into the nearest room or building, lock the door, and turn off all lights.
It was a lockdown announcement, though I honestly didn't pay it any attention, considering they were all practice, and so I just continued to sit there in the stall and wait. But just then, all the lights to the building seemingly shut off all at once. The hum of the light faded, along with the buzzing of the AC unit, which meant all the power to the school had been cut off. The bathroom had gone pitch black, and that's when I was actually starting to get worried. Power was never cut off during practice lockdown drills. I texted my friend asking him what was going on, and literally right away he answered back with a text saying, "Dude, where are you? It's a real lockdown. Everyone's asking where you are." I told him I was in the bathroom, and he responds saying I should hide. But where else could I go? I wasn't just going to run out into the hallway to find a better spot. So ultimately I decided to stay and hide in the stall I was in. I turned my phone's brightness down and texted my friend again. I asked him what the reason was for the lockdown, and after 5 long minutes of waiting, he replied saying that apparently there was a kid armed with a knife banging on classroom doors and asking to be let in. Both my classroom and the bathroom I was in were on the same floor, so I turned off my phone and tried my best to see if I could hear anything. There were running footsteps, and that was shortly followed by the sound of the bathroom door opening. I was absolutely horrified at what I was hearing. Whoever entered walked towards the stall next to me, went inside, and shut the door. I held my breath for what seemed like forever. Then, to break the silence, in a shaky voice, I said, "Who's in here?" It was silent for a second, and then I heard a voice reply with, "I'm just looking for a place to hide. I heard there was a lockdown over the speakers." That didn't really answer my question, but the guy sounded around my age, and so I decided I'd just let it go. We sat in silence for what seemed like forever, when finally we got another announcement telling all students to exit the school in an orderly fashion through the front doors, where cops would be waiting outside. I exited the stall, but was surprised to see the guy next to me didn't. I asked him if he was coming, and he replied saying, Yeah man, just give me a couple minutes." I thought that was weird, but regardless, I left the bathroom and started heading towards the front exit of the school. As I was walking, my phone went off. My friend had texted me. He said that apparently a kid who was maybe a couple years older than us tried to rob a nearby gas station at knife point. The guy actually stabbed a couple people, and when he was unsuccessful in getting any money, he ran to hide in our school to blend in as one of the students. But what horrified me the most was the last sentence. My friend said that the cops outside were saying that the kid was still inside, and that he was hiding somewhere in the back of the school. Reading this changed my walk to the front doors into a full-on sprint. Right as I got outside, I would frantically inform one of the police officers of what I had experienced. And after they searched the bathroom, they found it was empty, but that the window inside was broken. The kid had broken and escaped through the window. Needless to say, for the next few school days, I had gotten a lot of unwanted attention because of what I had experienced. As far as I know, the kid still hasn't been caught, and it's still just difficult for me to come to terms with the fact that I was unknowingly hiding in a stall right next to the guy I was trying to hide from. I somewhat recently got my first real job as a teacher at a public elementary school in a nearby neighborhood. It was the first school year I was teaching, and at this point it was only September, so needless to say, I was still learning the ropes. It was honestly pretty stressful. I teach a first grade class of around 20 kids, so you can imagine how chaotic it would get at times, especially with my lack of experience. I remember one day, I was in the middle of assigning the kids a worksheet for spelling simple words, when the principal's voice came over the school's loudspeaker and ordered a lockdown. Now, being a new teacher, I wasn't yet informed of when the school had practiced lockdown drills around the year. Therefore, I had no idea if this was a drill or not. But I knew either way I had to follow protocol. I turned off the room's lights, locked the doors and windows, and had the kids sit against the walls out of sight. I'd say maybe 5 minutes passed of complete silence, when I could faintly start to hear doors being banged on down the hall. I could feel my heart start to race as the sounds got louder as whoever was banging on the doors got closer. At this point, I still had no idea whether it was just the principal checking all the classroom locks or an actual intruder in the school. But my thoughts were interrupted by one of my students bursting out crying. It was too loud. There's no doubt whoever was outside would have been able to hear it. I could tell. The banging outside stopped in response to the noise, shortly after followed by a single pair of footsteps walking up to the door. It was silent for a few seconds, but the silence was quickly broken by a male's voice yelling out, "Hey guys, I think there's kids in this one." And that confirmed this lockdown was real. More footsteps could be heard running up to the door, and that's when genuine attempts to break down the door were made by multiple people. At that point, not a single kid in the class wasn't crying or screaming in fear. I didn't know what to do. I was never trained for this kind of situation. And that's when 2 gunshots could be heard. But it didn't come from the intruders. Police were now inside the building. Right after the shots were fired, the intruders could be heard running down the hall. 30 minutes later, and we were given the all clear. It turns out the intruders were 3 local high school students. They were eventually caught, but when asked why they did it, they would say close to nothing. Although, one of the kids claimed it was a bet, but personally I don't believe that for a second. No bet is worth going to court over and even possibly losing your freedom. I firmly believe they had much worse intentions. Although most likely traumatized, luckily no one was physically hurt. The shots that were fired by the police were claimed to have been warning shots and were aimed directly into the ground. It's been 2 years since this all happened, and I still teach first grade at the same school and even in the same classroom. And to this day, those bullet holes can still be seen in the school's hallway. This happened back when I was in middle school. Technically, it was actually my last day in middle school. It was late May, and for our last day, our school would do a sort of field day where the whole school would play a bunch of games to celebrate the end of the school year. Now, back then, I used to be a pretty active kid, but unfortunately, due to a recent concussion, I was unable to participate in any games the whole day. I was pretty disappointed, yeah, though I did bring my DS and quickly opted to just sit inside one of the classrooms and play that, as, there wasn't really anything else I could do. None of the teachers seemed to mind, so there I was, all by myself in the classroom for my science class playing my DS, all the while the other kids got to play games in the school's gymnasium. It was a weird feeling being in that classroom alone. I don't really know how to explain it. Up until that point, I don't think I'd ever been in a classroom completely alone. Something that needs to be mentioned is that the teachers that weren't watching the kids in the gymnasium were in a room across the hall having meetings. I'd say I was playing on my DS for not even an hour, when my English teacher, Miss Allen, rushed up to the classroom's door and closed it from the outside. She didn't say anything to me, so I figured she just wanted to make sure I couldn't hear whatever the teachers were talking about across the hall. Forgetting about it, I went back to playing my DS. A couple minutes later, the classroom's door swung open. I expected to see one of the teachers coming in to check on me, but no, a man I'd never seen before walked into the room and closed the door behind him. The guy had to have at least been in his 50s, and so I just assumed it was some kid's dad. It wasn't unusual for parents to come into the school to bring a student their lunch, so I asked if he was looking for someone. He replied with no, in a tone that seemed almost offended that I would even ask that question. Before I could say anything else, the guy started walking towards me. I asked him what he was doing, and that's when he lifted up his shirt, revealing a handgun on his waistband. He followed it up by saying, "Look, kid, I'm gonna need you to come with me, or I'm gonna kill you." The guy said it in the most carefree tone I had ever heard, and that, along with the fact that I'd never even seen a gun in person before, instantly overwhelmed me with pure fear. Before I could fully comprehend the danger of the situation I was in, the guy firmly grabbed my wrist and started pulling me towards the classroom door. But before we got into the hallway, the deafening sound of our school's lockdown alarm started going off. This was followed by the guy instantly letting go of my wrist and making a run for it down the hall and through a back exit. I stood there in shock for a second, but ultimately went back inside the classroom. I'm not sure how much time had passed when Miss Allen came back into the room and told me that she didn't want to scare me, but that there had been an intruder inside the building and a lockdown, which now was over, had taken place. I would tell her about the man, and instantly she brought me to a police officer who was already on the premises to explain what I had experienced. It turns out the man was the whole reason the school went into lockdown in the first place. The man was reported to have been scoping out the school all morning, and when he was seen getting close to the building itself, someone would call the police, which resulted in the lockdown. The guy was later caught and would openly admit that he had been trying to scare kids into getting into his car so he could kidnap them. And this reality still horrifies me to this day. Not a day goes by where I'm not thankful for the school's alarm going off when it did.
School lockdowns can be some of the most terrifying things you can experience. The general fear of what's going to happen next is very overwhelming for a lot of people, sometimes even if it's just a drill. In this video, we'll be going over 3 terrifying true school lockdown horror stories. If you guys do enjoy horror stories told in the first-person format, all I ask is that you consider subscribing, as that's the only content we post, and we upload around 4 videos weekly, sometimes even more. And be sure to stay to the end of the video, as honestly all of today's stories are absolutely terrifying. With that being said, let's continue into the school lockdown horror stories. It was a completely normal, boring school day. I was in 7th period math, and the clock showed 2:45 p.m., which means the school day was nearly done. As it was a Friday, and spring break was just around the corner, you could feel everyone getting antsy in their seats. A lot of people had tests and whatnot, whereas my class got to have fun. We had a super laid-back teacher who loved to entertain us as much as possible. We lucked out in that sense. Me and my girlfriend Haley were messing around in the back, talking about something that occurred earlier that day. When it happened, the alarm for the lockdown went off, and the principal came over the loudspeaker. Now, for some context, typically a teacher would yell lockdown 3 times if it was a drill. We were always told if it was 4 times, it was not a drill. The reason for this was to hide the fact that we knew someone was in the building with malicious intent. 4 times we heard the word lockdown. Now, I've gotten so used to hearing it only 3 times that I paid no attention to how many times lockdown was even said. The teacher did the usual, turning off the lights, closing the door, and ushering us to the back corner of the room where we couldn't be seen from the glass on the door. Our classroom had 2 doors, one at the front and one at the back. In the midst of all the commotion, me and Haley did the one thing you should never do in a lockdown. We snuck out of the class. We were now in the hallway on the 3rd floor. Everything looked so weird. Not a single person in sight other than the 2 of us. A sort of humming noise came from the walls, indicating the school had cut all the power. I thought this was weird, as I thought it was only a drill. "Hey, why would they cut off the power if it's just a drill?" I asked. This was when we really started to question if it was actually a drill or not. But with us being stupid teenagers, we brushed it off as nothing. We continued roaming the halls when we started to hear a sound. We got really creeped out by this, as no one was supposed to be outside the class. Fearing it was a teacher, we ran into the nearest bathroom to hide. We ran into the fourth stall that was tucked into the corner and hid. We sort of just sat there, giggling, thinking we outsmarted the teacher. Maybe about 30 seconds had passed, and we started to hear the footsteps again, but this time much closer. My heart froze. We could tell it was right outside the door. At this point, we were sure we'd been caught. We kept as quiet and as still as possible, hoping not to make a sound. It was really weird though. The person outside hadn't come in yet, but they hadn't left either. If they left, we would have clearly heard their footsteps leaving, but we never heard them. Haley pointed this out to me, and that's when we started taking the situation a bit more seriously. The door opened, and someone stepped in. I was about to walk out of the stall and apologize for sneaking off when Haley stopped me. She whispered to me, "Isn't it protocol for teachers to ask if there's anyone in the bathroom?" She was right. This wasn't normal teacher behavior, and that's when the heart-dropping realization hit us. Whoever was in the bathroom with us wasn't a teacher. While contemplating what to do, the silence was broken. "I know you're in there." My heart dropped as the person said that. The voice was younger, and it obviously wasn't a teacher. We were practically crying at this point, unable to hold it back. The guy was now directly in front of the stall door. He started pounding on the door and screaming like a madman. As this was happening though, I heard the door open again, followed by the familiar voice of my teacher, Mr. Taylor.
"Hey, what the hell are you doing?"
I heard a scuffle outside, and I immediately rushed to aid my teacher. Eventually we got the guy held down and the cops were called. Apparently, the man was an escapee from a mental asylum near the school, and thankfully, no one got hurt. I don't know if any of you guys remember a few years ago when a sort of killer clown craze shook America for a few months. Well, this all happened during that time. I always remembered me and my friends thought it was funny, and we'd always watch those clown caught on camera videos that were really popular at lunch. Although, our laughter turned into fear when we were made aware that a few of those clowns on Twitter threatened to come to our school at 11 a.m. that day and quote-unquote kill all of us. Luckily, the school picked up on this, and they sent out emails to the parents that they had scheduled a planned lockdown at 10:30 that day in response to the threats. I was sitting in history class when I heard the familiar sound of the lockdown alarm, followed by the teacher rushing to the windows and door, locking and closing them. Even though initially the threat freaked me out, I wasn't worried at this point. I reasoned that it was most likely just another blank threat online, and that nothing would happen. After about 40 minutes of silence, sitting on the cold floor in the corner of the room, the emergency green flashing light turned off, then followed by the air conditioning slowly falling silent, and then the hallway lights switched off. The school had cut the power, but why though? At this point, me and my classmates were staring at each other. We all knew that something real was going on, as the school never cut off the power unless something serious was happening. After 10 minutes or so, we could all hear a faint banging noise from down the corridor, shortly followed by heavy and fast footsteps. Someone was running down the hallway. They started banging on the lockers and screaming. At this point, a few girls started quietly crying. Just then, the most terrifying thing ever happened. One of the men, dressed as a clown, ran up to the class door, banging and screaming. Multiple people were crying now, and one of my friends whispered to me in complete seriousness, saying we were all gonna die. I have no shame in admitting that this caused me to start crying too. I then heard the loud sound of glass shattering. The man had shattered the glass part of the door, and I could see his arm reaching through to try to unlock the door from the inside. I was frozen and in complete disbelief as to what I was witnessing. But luckily, my teacher reacted quickly, grabbing a piece of shattered glass from the ground and stabbing the man's arm before he could unlock the door. He instantly grabbed his arm back, and you could hear his screams of pain. He then quickly stepped away from the door, and his screams slowly faded down the corridor. After another 2 hours, the principal came on the loudspeaker, explaining everything. He said that just after 11, 2 men walked into the school, one holding a kitchen knife. They ran around the school, threatening to kill students and trying to break into classrooms. But once the police raided the school, only one of them was caught, and it wasn't the one who tried to break into our classroom. After the whole event, the school got over 20 buses to take the younger kids home, and the kids 9th grade and over, like me, were told to walk home in groups and call the cops if we saw anything suspicious. I had a hard week at school after that experience. I was always thinking that the men would return, this time with a gun or something, but nothing happened. This, nonetheless, will be scarred into my mind forever. Ever since the lockdown, the school has hired a few more on-campus police officers, and they've installed some auto-locking features on doors and windows. This has made me feel a little bit better in school, but this isn't just an experience you can simply forget about. I live in the middle of nowhere. The school I go to has maybe 500 students in total. It's enough for everyone to know everyone's name. Regardless, this day our school went on lockdown. That familiar, yet eerie chime of our principal's voice saying to remain in our classes until further notice rang through the building over the intercoms. His voice was surprisingly calm, especially considering the fact that he didn't even say it was a drill. Despite our little town, crime isn't completely unheard of. We've had our fair share of reported break-ins, robberies, and even some gang activity.
I bet it's a robber down at Chase Bank.
My friend Kyle joked. I laughed, and we started talking about what we actually thought the whole lockdown was for. Kyle's voice was beginning to get louder, only interrupted by our teacher, Miss Sander herself, shushing him. It had now been about 10 minutes of complete silence, but like most high schoolers tend to, we all lost our patience. Everyone was now talking softly to whoever they were sitting next to at this point. Just then, we all heard it. Footsteps. Not just one pair, but a few walking down the hall. We all went quiet, knowing that something was wrong, and if this was a drill, it would have been just one pair of footsteps, that being the teacher checking on the classrooms. Even Kyle, who had previously been talking, grew silent. Miss Sander moved slowly to the doorway, peering out from behind a corner. The heaviness in the air was suffocating. Just then, we heard footsteps again, seemingly doing another lap around the school. A girl across the room let out a muffled sob of fear. I focused my attention on the door. I was leaning out from behind a table to peer through the window to see if I could see anything. I'm not sure what I expected to see, but whatever I was expecting, a whole lot of nothing was not it. The hallway was empty and completely dark, as it tends to be when no one was in it. The lights were all automated in my school, but just then, I noticed some of them turn on. A wave of yellow light instantly filled the room as we huddled in, casting shadows against the rows of desks. Someone somewhere tried to calm the crying girl, but I could hear their own murmured voice waver. I was still looking through the door's window from a distance at this point. But of course, as I was doing this, I saw someone walk up to the window and start looking through into the room. I instantly ducked back down behind the table the whole class was hiding behind. I felt my heart beat wildly as I heard the sound of the doorknob start to shift. My vision grew static as I pulled my knees to my chest, curling up tightly in the corner of the room. The door shook as the guy banged on it repeatedly, and as he was doing this, my biggest fear came true. The door hinges gave out, and this guy proceeded to walk into the classroom. All of us went silent, praying this man wouldn't walk over to the corner of the room and see all of us hiding behind this table. About a minute passed of just this guy standing there, and we could hear someone else sprinting to the door, followed by the words,
Dude, we gotta go. The cops are already here.
That's when I heard the guy start running out of the room and down the hall. The cops came, and a little later that was it. The guys who entered the school were never caught, and apparently they were armed with guns. The story goes that one of the kids at my school tweeted at a gang, essentially making fun of them the night before that school day. And of course, the gang took it very seriously and planned on raiding the school and killing the kid responsible. Luckily, they weren't successful, but this experience still terrifies me nonetheless.
I went to middle school at a private school where the middle and high school was comprised of only 30 students. One of the assistant coaches for my middle school team was a soft-spoken man that volunteered for many of our school functions. I assume this is due to the fact that he had 2 adopted sons that attended my school. One was a grade older and one was a couple of grades below me. I didn't really remember him at all until I graduated high school and out of the blue get a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Still don't know how he got my number. It turns out to be that this man was wishing me a happy graduation. I at first thought that he was just friendly, but then he called back insisting on taking me for a steak dinner. I tried to politely decline, but he began texting me and calling me nonstop. This made me really uncomfortable, and so I sternly requested he leave me be. A couple of years later, I am a sophomore in college and I received this email. Dear me, I shall try one last time, though not to bother, but to seek a friendship that I can feel can work and benefit us both. It seems that most people pass through their lives and leave a vacant mark, soon to be forgotten, or, if thought of, just a passing blip that does not linger. However then, there are those who leave their mark as if to say, I am somebody of value, I want to make a difference. I'm not sure where or how I so tragically messed up in trying to recapture a friendship that I felt important, not wanting anything more or anything less, but a friendship of value and a meaning that would be of importance to two lives. Long ago, as a soccer coach, there was a young man of intrigue on my team. His intelligence shone through his skills on the soccer field, and there was something there, something that sparked the thought of value. It was difficult to define, harder still to understand. Nonetheless, that young man left a mark that would stay in the portals of my mind. Typically, society does not take kindly to a grown married man taking up a friendship with a young man with a family of his own. Innocent, of course, respectfully even more, but still looked at with this inevitable stink eye. Maybe one day the paths of this coach and team member will cross again. Most of the friendships that I value in my life have come along in the most unusual way. For instance, the 19-year-old female classmate at mortuary school that just seemed to fit under my wing. I was the one that was not interested in hitting on her, just establishing a friendship that could last for years to come. Or perhaps the 93-year-old lady in the nursing home who was hungry for the company of someone that enjoyed listening to her stories of times gone by. The 70-year-old author from Casey County that immediately gave a feeling of commonality that was uncovered after just a few dinners and glasses of Merlot. A young friend of a son who, lacking a father figure, just wanted respect from a generation that was not willing to give it. I could go on and on. I have found that the old saying that you can't pick your family, however, you can pick your friends is of tremendous value in my life. Souls are waiting around every corner or in the most bizarre places, but when you encounter them, the rewards are endless. What does all this mean? For you, perhaps nothing, or maybe, just maybe, something. This is for you to decide. Nature may have already taken its course, but I try not to give up on anything that I consider of value in my life or the lives of others. Best regards, him. I responded extremely curtly and notified this man that I forwarded the email to my father, attorney at law. I don't like to speculate, but considering the nature of the adoption of the demeanor and behavior of his sons growing up, as well as their age of proximity to me, I really worry about their upbringing. I never heard from this man since, but my younger sister said one of her male friends has had similar interactions with him. To add to the creepiness, this man is a mortician in my county. I would like to add a bit more context to this story. I would receive multiple voicemails a day of this man telling me things like, I want to take you out to a big steak dinner. Anything you want. We can even share some wine at my house before, or I don't know what I'm doing wrong and why you were pushing me away. I think we can truly get along great. Now, I agree. At first I thought this man was simply reaching out to me in a friendly manner, but the persistence after being nicely turned down is what raised red flags. After starting college, I received a new phone number as well as a new email address. Not for this reason, but because I got my own phone plan and started university with a new email. My second year here, he tracked down both informations again. This is when he sent this letter as well as started the calls again. It was only after telling the man that I forwarded his email to my father, who happened to be an attorney, that he left me alone. A few months later, the county prosecutor contacted me requesting information. When I recalled this story, I did a quick Google search of his email and name and found at least 2 obituaries of 14 and 15-year-old boys that live in different states from him, where he posts on the online funeral page expressing condolences. I won't add his exact wording or the sites because I don't want to reveal his identity, but both were identical and went something like this. Parents, may God give you strength. I feel like I have gotten to know your son through the Facebook posts and messages we have shared, and have grown to love him and have plenty of respect for him. My heart is aching. I love you. Insert son's name. It is speculative, but it sounds as if he doesn't personally know these boys, and the similar wording he uses to the letter he sent me further raises red flags. And lastly, I want to reiterate that I barely knew this man. We never had an opportunity to be alone and develop some bond that he refers to. He was the assistant coach for my middle school soccer team. I rarely even made it on the field as I was in the 6th grade and it was a middle school team. It was not as if he was some teacher I saw every day and I sincerely left an impression on him. I didn't even remember he existed until the calls and emails started. I was a 911 dispatcher for almost 11 years. 11 long years of receiving the calls of everyone from entitled do-gooders to terrified pleading victims of serious violent crimes. I spent a long time compartmentalizing the more harrowing calls, years letting go of the pain and suffering I soaked up like a sponge during the years I spent sat in front of a switchboard computer. I've had numerous sleepless nights, countless visits to state-appointed therapists, but only one emergency call really sticks with me, one that I could never shake off or push to the back of my mind. I have a copy of the transcripts to the call, so I'll be referencing my copy to ensure my recollection of the events are as accurate as possible. This is the story of the Ashland Jane Doe. Working in more than 6,000 call centers nationwide, 911 dispatchers form the vital link between callers in distress and emergency response teams that assist them. Through efficient handling and assessment, we reduce response times and help save lives. That's the idea that got me into the career in the first place, saving lives. I'd never been particularly athletic, so a career in law enforcement or the military was never really in the cards for me. That always bothered me. I grew up intensely idealistic, and I've always had my heart set on a career where I could help people, help make the world a better place. So when I found out that I could apply to be a 911 dispatcher and help play a part of such a vital public service, I jumped at the chance. We were told that the job wasn't for everyone, that it could take a serious psychological toll on those that volunteered. I know it sounds crazy, but that only made it more appealing. It was, after all, public service, service being the operative word. It would be rough, frustrating, even depressing sometimes, but I would be providing a much-needed aid to my fellow Americans, often during the darkest, most terrifying moments of their lives. I should also add that it requires specialist training to be a police dispatcher. Being a general call taker or even an emergency medical service dispatcher is a tough gig, but a police dispatcher was a cut above, and we all knew it. Only the most intelligent, strong-willed, and decisive candidates are granted roles as police dispatchers. So naturally, I was over the moon when I passed the applicant's exam and was given a place on the training course. I was a pretty experienced member of the police dispatchers when the call from Ashland Jane Doe came through. Just a few hours into my shift, I recently returned from the break room with a flash of strong black coffee to fuel me throughout the night. You always seem to say a little prayer whenever a call is patched through, hoping it's nothing too serious, nothing too upsetting. But as soon as I heard the girl's voice, I knew it would be bad. You see, screamers are bad. You can barely hear them, they're incoherent, and basically you have to spend like the first 5 minutes of the call just getting them to breathe enough to communicate. But the worst by far are the whisperers. The whisperers call when whatever is putting them in danger is close, real close. Whisperers do so because they are in grave, imminent danger. Whisperers call because they're being hunted. 911, what is the address of your emergency? I asked. The call had already been picked up by a general call taker, patched through to me once it established that the caller needed the police. Right across from the 4th Street laundromat. There was a slight pause before the girl whispered. The fact that she didn't know exactly where she was gave me a terrible sinking feeling. This was going to be a rough one. What's the problem? I replied, trying to sound as casual as possible. Younger callers seem to respond better that way. I've been abducted. The way she sounded so calm, so matter-of-fact, it was utterly chilling. There was no hope in the girl's voice, even though she was so close now to rescue. But you're at the laundromat? I asked, consulting a map of the area. It was right in the middle of Ashland, surrounded by a commercial and residential district. She wasn't held up in some barn in the middle of nowhere despite being thoroughly disturbed. I reassured myself with the thought that this would be an easy rescue. No, I'm in the bedroom with him. Him. The words seemed to rattle around in my skull. She was in the bedroom with him. Do you know what color the house is? I tried to change the subject slightly to garner more information, sure, but also to try to keep the girl calm, keep her mind occupied. No, was all she said. This was a spanner in the works, a big one. The police can't just go kicking in the door of every apartment or house opposite the 4th Street laundromat. Yet before I could press her for more detail, she spoke again. Please hurry. My heart rate began to pick up at this point. She was obviously in danger, perhaps extreme danger. I had to remain professional and continue my assessment of the situation. Does he have a weapon? I asked, already preparing to send out an APB to muster the officers required for a rescue. Got a taser. She lowered her voice even further as she spoke, but still she didn't seem overwhelmed by fright. I considered for a moment that whoever was may have drugged the poor girl to keep her sedated. Are you injured? A little. Her whisper was haunting by the point. She sounded like she'd been driven half insane by the ordeal. Is there any way you can get out of the building? I don't know. Without waking him, I'm scared. She was broken by fear, numb with it. Is there a bathroom in the house? I remember my voice breaking. I was so scared for this poor little thing. I wanted so badly for her to just drop the phone and run for her life. His bedroom is closed and he made it so it would make noise. Will he do something to you? I'd never been so intense, not during my entire time as a dispatcher. Yeah, he had me tied up. Are you tied up now? Well, no, I kind of freed myself. That's my girl, I remember thinking. She was a fighter, a survivor. Oh, she suddenly said. I think I woke him. I think I woke him up. Just set the phone down. My heart was in my mouth. There was silence, what seemed like minutes of uninterrupted silence as I half expected the screams to commence. Finally, I brought myself to say something, anything down the silent phone line. Are you still there? How much longer? Was all she asked. It broke my heart. I didn't know. I just didn't know. I kept her on the line as I immediately dispatched officers to the laundromat. Luckily, there were only 2 houses immediately opposite the place in what was otherwise an industrial complex. I can't tell you how relieved I was when I finally heard the voices of the dispatch officers. They'd broken into the house of the kidnapper and were in the process of freeing the poor girl from captivity. Show me your hands. Put up your effing hands right now, do it, I heard one of them bellow. I held back tears knowing that that poor young woman was finally safe from him. She was most definitely in danger too. When the police searched the house, they found the bodies of 2 other young women that had disappeared in the months before the critical 911 call. Jane Doe is called that because her identity cannot be revealed, standard procedure for all victims of assault. Her abductor, Sean Michael Great, was found guilty of murdering Stacy Stanley and Elizabeth Griffith, and was later sentenced to death for his crimes. During the trial, he stated that despite having killed before, he had no intention of killing the kidnapped Jane Doe and was in fact intending to marry her. That's what really gets to me. The thought of the brutal, potentially short life that poor girl would have ended up living as the unwilling bride of such a murderous, unfeeling psychopath. Where she would be if she hadn't loosened her bindings, found the phone, and called in her own rescue on that fateful spring night. Ask a cop which day of the year they dread working the most. One or two might answer Christmas or Super Bowl Sunday, and I get that. But 9 out of 10 will give you the same tired look before they utter one single word: Halloween. Halloween might just be some light-hearted spooky fun for some, but for law enforcement, it's no joke. The small New England town I serve in has a spike of about 6 or 7 times the number of emergency calls on Halloween night alone. It really does bring out the absolute worst in people. I mean, there's the stuff we anticipate every year: ungenerous houses having suffered a barrage of weaponized eggs, trees covered in toilet paper, homeowners complaining of juvenile trespassers. Those calls are manageable, but they bog down our on-duty officers so that when serious crimes happen, we're dangerously understrength. But all of the dumb Halloween mischief I've had to respond to over the years, all of it pales in comparison to what I found at the house on the end of Jefferson Street. That was a Halloween night I don't think I'll ever forget. I just responded to a call regarding a group of teenagers who had apparently been engaging in some pretty aggressive trick-or-treating, all without costumes. That type of stuff is exactly why I hate Halloween. No, what they were doing wasn't strictly illegal, but I can't exactly have a bunch of knuckle-draggers making trouble on a night like that, especially not with the hundreds of excited children roaming the streets. I lecture them. They roll their eyes, but I join the force to get into car chases with bad guys, not argue semantics with a bunch of stoned brats. They walk away, muttering stuff that I choose to ignore while I get back in my patrol car. The radio almost immediately buzzes to life. My dispatcher says something over the radio involving this rundown house over on Jefferson Street. I start the car up, listening as he describes a member of the public calling to report that the house has Halloween decorations that were too scary. She then says it's the second call that day and I should go over and check it out if I have a minute to spare. She always did have a sense of humor. She knew well I was off my feet. We had a little laugh about it. Like I said, we get some seriously ridiculous calls on Halloween. It's not just dumb kids. It's bitter old misers and party poopers who honestly just resent people having a good time. This one good Christian lady calls us every year over trespassing trick-or-treaters, on kids, who calls the cops on actual children. Anyway, I carry about my duties, responding to calls and generally keeping an eye out for trouble. A few hours slip by, the sun sets, the smaller kids, led by their parents, disappear back into their homes until it's just a few older groups on their way to parties and whatnot. Then, the dispatcher gets on to me about this house on Jefferson. She says she had 3 more calls about the decorations, how they're scaring kids and even some parents, and she needs me to roll over there to check it out. Great. Arguing with some slasher movie-obsessed hermit who's probably about to get all sovereign citizen on me. Just what I need to make me feel like a guardian of the innocent. Sometimes I feel like the world's grumpy stepfather, honestly. So I take the ride over there, to this smaller part of town that's a little more run down, arriving on Jefferson. I see the house immediately. There was absolutely no missing it. The old colonial-looking place was covered in Halloween decorations. Cardboard standees of vampires and zombies, a ton of fake cobwebs all over the porch. I think I counted like 20 carved pumpkins dotted all over the lawn. Pretty intricate designs, too. But hanging from a large oak just to the side of the house was the most disturbing Halloween decoration I had ever seen. Not disturbing because it looked real. The limbs of the figure were too rigid, the hair a little too artificial, but the placement of the thing. It really did set me on edge as I stared out of the patrol car at it. The figure hung by a rope from one of the oak tree's long, thick branches, drifting gently in the fall breeze. Look, I'm a cop. I've seen some stuff. I don't frighten easily. I'm very logical, very level-headed, but that thing sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped out of the car, keeping my eyes glued to the hanging decoration as I walked towards it, the sound of crunching leaves under my feet with each and every step. Reaching for the flashlight on my belt, I pointed the torch beam over towards the tree. I could see why people had called this in. The texture on the thing's skin, it was very graphic, blotchy, and purple, almost like an actual corpse. I only took another few steps before I felt extremely foolish for my previous thought. The smell, the sickly sweet smell of death, hung in the air along with what I thought was just a cheeky decoration. It wasn't. It was an actual corpse that had been hanging there all day. Hundreds of kids must have walked past there, only a few of them actually recognizing that the thing hanging from the tree was a real cadaver. I felt sick. Sprinting back to my patrol car, I radioed into dispatch to get the coroner out to Jefferson Street as soon as possible. My dispatcher was absolutely horrified when she learned what I had, that other people had been staring at a dead body all day, many of them none the wiser. The hanged man was a one Richard Dodd, a retired teacher who was reported to have been caught up in some vigilante pedo sting. According to investigating officers, Mr. Dodd had been tricked into revealing questionable interest to individuals that were posing as an underage girl. When they threatened to go public with some of the more despicable things he said online, Mr. Dodd had opted for the easy way out, systematically fashioning a rope and doing the deed, all without a thought for who might happen across his body. People give me a hard time for not being into Halloween as a holiday, for rolling my eyes when grown adults talk about how wasted they're going to get or what costume they have picked out. But if they knew the things that went on around them on that grisly night, things that are sometimes hiding in plain sight, I don't think they'd be so quick to celebrate. I was an emergency dispatcher for 9 years before Katrina hit. The summer before my junior year of high school, I decided to get involved with law enforcement after doing a couple of ride-alongs with the police department. I had half expected them to be full of car chases, wailing sirens, taking down bad guys, but when I saw what they really did during their patrols, it completely changed my opinion of cops in general. It wasn't about being cool with a badge and a gun. It was more about community policing. They knew people by their first names, helped the elderly with their groceries, and kept local kids out of trouble. They were making a difference, not just two guys on a power trip gunning people down for no reason. So I started running the radio part-time on the weekends and during the summer when I was out of school, eventually moving into a full-time position after high school when a position opened up. It's not exactly illegal for someone under the age of 18 to work at a dispatch center, but I wasn't allowed to actually answer 911 calls without an APCO certified operator on the console with me until I was fully employed and fully qualified. And just so you all know, APCO stands for Association of Public Safety Communications Officials, and it's standard all over the country for people to get certified by them before they can work in dispatch centers. It was, however, very illegal for me to run the NCIC, National Crime Information Center, computer without being certified to do so, and there was absolutely no way of that happening until my 18th birthday. So I ran the medical and fire dispatch console for all of Mobile County when I was part-time, and got my certifications when I graduated. I was also a volunteer firefighter, EMR, during this time as well. Also not illegal and quite common in rural parts of Alabama, but I suppose that's all another story. I was a 911 operator in Mobile, Alabama the same day Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. We started getting lots and lots of calls from over in New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast for some reason. I guess because they started routing through to us after all the 911 centers to the west started going down. Anyways, I got a call from a woman who said she was trapped in her house on Gordon Street between Florida and Law. I was confused at first because we have a Florida street here in Mobile, and after checking and double-checking and not being able to find her address, I asked her what city she was calling from. New Orleans, came the reply. My heart sank. Water had completely flooded the ground floor of her home and was slowly, gradually rising. I asked her if she could find any way out of the house, if there were any accessible windows on the second floor she could use. She said no, that she lived in a small single-story home that had an attic, and that was all. I tried to route her to New Orleans 911 and New Orleans Fire Department, but could not get through. Dispatch centers up and down the country were experiencing the same ridiculous volume of calls from the NOLA and Gulf Coast areas. When I finally did break through and reach a department somewhere, the lines were dead, brought down by the sheer ferocity that the hurricane brought. I tried to keep her calm, talking to her about her friends and family, the life she had before the storm arrived. She seemed like a popular woman. Her concerns were mostly for elderly relatives that were even less capable of protecting themselves than she was. I'll never forget that, the selflessness she displayed even when she was in such dire straits herself. When she said the water was waist-high, I told her to climb up into her attic with some food and water to keep her going. She joked about emptying the fridge, taking everything up into the attic. Might as well finish off last night's leftovers if the refrigerator would need to be replaced. She was such a strong woman. It's amazing how the human spirit can bloom even in the worst of situations, something I've found time and time again while working those phones. After a while, I heard her voice begin to get panicky, her breathing becoming short. She began to tell me that the flood water was beginning to leak up into the attic through the floorboards, how she didn't expect the water to have risen so much. I was stunned. I hadn't expected that either. In fact, it came as such an unwelcome revelation that I began to panic myself. Other than the roof, there was nowhere for the woman to escape to if the water kept rising. I asked her if there were any attic windows she could climb out of. She said no. By that point, I was starting to really worry. She was indeed trapped in an enclosed space with floodwaters rapidly rising. In desperation, I told her to find something heavy, something she could use to bash out the roof tiles or smash through a ventilation unit so she could escape onto the roof. For a painful few minutes, I heard her grunting and cursing as she used some unknown object to try to break her way out. I listened as the strikes grew weaker and less frequent. She soon returned to the phone with terrible news. I can't do it. I can't fit through the vent either. What am I going to do? She was panicking, shouting now about the amount of water seeping into the attic, how it was ankle height and rising fast. I honestly felt my heart break in my chest when I heard her voice break as tears formed in her eyes. She was crying, and she was losing hope. I told her I would stay on the line with her for as long as she wanted me to. I did so, staying on the line and listening as she cried, prayed, cussed, and prayed some more. A little while later, I could hear her struggling to keep her head and phone above water, and then the phone went dead. To this day, I don't know if she lived or died. I quit the dispatch center about 3 months after Katrina. I booked myself into counseling sessions at a therapist's office over in downtown Mobile, hoping it could help me rationalize and compartmentalize some of the more horrific calls I had to handle. But I was surprised to hear that the therapist actually thought I should quit. He specialized in cop and dispatchers, the kinds of people who rub noses with the worst of the worst on a daily basis. He went on to explain that people only have so much of a capacity for trauma, how I may have just reached my limit. But I have no regrets. If I had to burn out the last of my wits staying on the line with that poor, ill-fated woman over in New Orleans, it was worth it. I'd do it all again, in a heartbeat. The scariest thing that ever happened to me as a police officer here in the UK wasn't some horrendous terror attack or overly gory crime scene. The incidents that stick with you are the ones that involve what I like to call human drama. When you get an insight into just how terrifying a person's psyche can be and the things it can lead them to do. I arrived at my duty station at 6 o'clock in the morning. I had finished work at around 11 the previous night and ended up running into an assault on an old man on the way home. My journey into work was about an hour, so instead of getting home in a reasonable time, I get home after midnight. I have a quick bite with my wife and get to bed at around 1 a.m., giving me about 3 to 4 hours of sleep before I'm back on duty. It's one of the worst things about my job. We're expected to go above and beyond on a daily basis. That, I can tell you, can prove to be completely and utterly exhausting. It frays their nerves, makes the emotions rawer, and generally makes the job that little bit more difficult. Anyway, about 15 minutes into my early shift, I'm on station duties and a bloke comes in to tell us that he thinks his wife is missing. He seemed very reluctant to give us the details, and at one point, I have to drag information out of him. Essentially, they'd had some kind of domestic argument. She stormed out and didn't come home that night. I check her on the system, and she's actually been previously arrested for a couple of domestic violence incidences. I dig a little deeper, and I discover that they are actually against her son, rather than her husband. Situations like this are rarely black and white, but this one was just all kinds of convoluted. Now at this point I am very, very tired and definitely not in the best of moods. I read over the notes I had written down and confirm some details, and then send the fellow home to wait for his wife. I call around the local hospitals, check our own police databases to make sure she hasn't been arrested. I circulate her details to all units in the area and then type out a digital report on the incident. After that, I'd done all I was obligated to do, and technically there isn't actually anything else for me to do other than wait for my superior to provide guidance. I go and get a cup of coffee. All I wanted to do is sleep, but something is bothering me. Something about the husband. Despite no indicators of him having committed a crime, I was deeply suspicious of him. Whenever someone appears to be withholding information, there is always a reason, and the sooner we get to the bottom of that, the better. I went down to talk with the most senior officer available, asking him if I could go over to the guy's house, have a look around, and maybe talk to the husband again. The senior guy, this grizzled older sergeant, wasn't delighted with the suggestion, because it meant that he'd have to cover the desk due to being short-staffed, but he agreed, and off I go. I arrived at the house and began to talk to the husband. I asked him if I can have a look around, explaining that there might be something that could shed some light on where she might have gone. I make a preliminary inspection of the house, finding several containers of pills with weird names. A quick Google search reveals that this woman appears to be on a cocktail of antidepressants, mood stabilizers, and the like. I also find an insulin kit, leading me to believe that if she's a diabetic, her life could be in danger without medication. I asked the husband about these, and he mentions that his wife has had some quote-unquote emotional problems. I proceed to sit him down, remarking that there is a lot of medication here, then asking him if his wife has more than one insulin kit. He goes pale at this point. She'd left all her medication at home. I ask him where she keeps her handbag, and we end up checking her bedside cabinet. The handbag is missing, but I manage to take a look at a framed picture for future reference. I have absolutely no idea what this woman looks like, and ask her husband if I can search the room. He's beginning to completely break down at this point, and tells me I can do whatever it takes at this point to find his missing wife. Feeling distinctly uneasy at this point with a banging headache from sleep deprivation, I don't find any sign of missing clothes in the wardrobe or any secret stashes of cash or drugs. I don't know what led me to do it, but I decided to search the bed. I turned his pillow, and there's a note under it. It's a note explaining in no uncertain terms that the man's missing wife has the intention to end her life. The note goes on to say that she cannot go on, that she's sorry for being a burden. I radio back to the police station and update them on the situation. I'm then forced to return to the living room and tell this woman's husband that he had failed to notice that he had been sleeping on her note overnight. That was probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. We found her eventually, though it took another 8 hours or so to pin her down. We pinged her mobile phone to a nearby cell tower, but that just gave us a general locality. I tried to press the husband for information on where she may have gone, but he said that she didn't have any friends or family in the area. Later on, the husband telephones the police station and explains that they spent a weekend in a nearby seaside town shortly after they got married. I called the hotel they stayed in on that occasion, but they'd had no one by that name, I went down in person and showed them the picture. The lady at the desk told me that a guest answering that description had just left for a walk on the pier. When I went out to the pier in question, there she was. She actually seemed quite calm. There was nothing overly dramatic about her appearance or demeanor. She actually had the cheek to tell me that I looked awful, to which I explained jokingly that was partially her fault. I asked her to give life a chance for a few more days, that her husband loved her and that she wasn't a burden. She agreed and we brought her home. A couple of days later, she came to the station with a box of chocolates and a thank you card. One of those generic kinds that in no way revealed just what she was thanking me for. It was deeply surreal to receive a card like that for preventing the ending of someone's life. The family sends a similar card every year around the anniversary of the events. A stark reminder of just how effective good police work can be. A few years ago, I came home from work to find my girlfriend sitting on the couch with a glum look on her face. When I asked her what the matter was, she gave me that fateful line, "We need to talk." She told me she wasn't happy in our relationship anymore and that she thought that we should take a break to see other people, essentially so we could decide if we really were supposed to be together. I really didn't want to, but I loved her enough to respect her decision and I agreed. I thought if I at least gave her idea a try, I'd eventually win her back, but a few weeks later our relationship was well and truly over, and I had to move out of the apartment that we shared. Since it was technically her apartment first, obviously I had to find a new place to live and fast, so I definitely didn't take all the time I should have to find somewhere decent, and I ended up paying for it pretty badly. The place I ended up renting was a one-room studio apartment in a building that straight up looked like a haunted house. I mean, that probably should have been a warning right there, but it was cheap, available, and the landlord only wanted a month's rent in advance to exchange for the keys. Plus, there was absolutely no way I was about to move back in with my mom and dad. Like, they'd be nice enough to offer, but it would have felt like way too much like a step back, and so I opted for the studio. Moving in was easy enough. I didn't have all that much in the way of possessions to take with me, and honestly, I just couldn't be bothered arguing with my then ex-girlfriend about who was entitled to what. The whole thing had been unpleasant enough without souring the broken relationship even further with petty arguments over furniture. Besides, as long as I had my Xbox and my 4K telly, I'd be happy enough. So the day after I move in, I knock at the flat across the hall from me to introduce myself to my neighbor. There was this thumping bass beat coming from the other side, so I knew someone was home. But when they answered, I was pretty shocked at how frank and unfriendly they were. The guy was quite young, with thick, dark beard and a Cockney accent, and he didn't open the door the whole way. He just opened like a little crack before peering out. I introduced myself, told him I moved in across the hallway from him, and added that if he ever needed to borrow a cup of sugar or anything, he knew where to find me. But all I got in return was this cold, nervous stare. I figured I might have interrupted him in something, so I apologized and added that my name was Ollie. He replied, telling me his name was Jack. I know this sounds mad, but I got the distinct impression it was a name that he just plucked out of the air. Just something in my gut told me that, as weird as this sounds, and that he just made it up on the spot. But I'm not really the paranoid type, so I just put it down to him being a generally awkward person or whatever before I disappeared back into my flat. A few weeks later, I was just leaving my flat to head off to work when I saw a guy leaving Jack's flat. I wished him a good morning, and he wished me the same, and I followed up by asking him if he was one of Jack's friends or his flatmate or something. "Who?" he replies. It was then that I smelled the alcohol in his breath. I repeated the question, pointing towards the door of the flat and reiterating that it was Jack's flat. Yeah, I'm Jack's mate," he said, before continuing down the stairs and out the front door. Now this one I definitely knew was a lie, and it was that which clued me into the fact that the original guy had been lying to me too. Something weird was going on with that flat, but just exactly what it was I couldn't possibly imagine at that stage. So, this keeps happening for about a fortnight longer, with me catching different people going in and out of the flat across the hallway at all hours of the night, So when the landlord calls to pick up the next month's rent, I bring up the tenants from across the hall and ask him exactly who it is that lives there. He racks his brain for a moment, finally coming up with the name Stephen as the name of the tenant, adding that he's the best tenant he's ever had, how there are no noise complaints, how he always pays the rent on time and on the first day of every month via a direct debit deposit into his bank account. I was on the verge of telling him all about the different people I'd seen, but it wasn't really any of my business, was it? I mean, yeah, it was probably something a bit dodgy going on over there, but as long as no one was getting hurt, what did it have to do with me? I'm not a grass, so I've never been. It's just not my nature, so I kept my gob shut, even though in time I'd really, really wish that I hadn't. About a week later, I was asleep in bed when something woke me up, a sound coming from outside my flat. It was of heavy footfalls on the stairs, and somehow I knew it was something to do with the flat across the hall. As I lay there all blurry-eyed, I finally decided that I was going to put a complaint into the landlord, but was nearly scared out of my skin when I heard a series of loud bangs on the front of my flat. "Merseyside Police! Open the door, or we smash it in!" My heart began to race, so hard that I could actually hear it pumping in my ears. I was frozen to the spot for a moment, and it took another few bangs and another shock before I could even get my head together. I ran to the threshold, pulling back the mortise lock before opening up the door. The next thing I know, there's a torch in my face, completely blinding me as a pair of armed, tactically dressed policemen storm into my flat and throw me to the ground. "Hands behind your back! Move and you're getting shot," one screamed, not even waiting for me to obey him as he pulled my hands into the small of my back and placed them in cuffs. "Get the bloody light on, Reg," he said to the other policeman, pulling me up onto my knees and telling me to stay put. So I'm up on my knees, facing the door of my flat, with the other officer keeping his back against the door, drawing it open. I can see that there is another pair of police officers who have been banging on the door of the flat across the hall, only there's no reply from inside. No one comes to open the door. So up comes this other policeman with one of those door basher things. I don't know the proper name, only that one of the police called it the big key. They smashed their way into the door, screaming as they went. I figured they started dragging out whoever was in there, or at least being as aggressive as they were with me. But bizarrely, it was almost the opposite tone. It was verging on kind and caring, and I listened in confusion as they asked the person, "Are you all right? Do you know where you are? Can you hear me?" It was a minute or so later I watched in absolute horror as one officer walked out of the flat carrying a girl who couldn't have been any older than a teenager. She was barely dressed, covered in bruises, and her hair was a greasy mess that was plastered to her scalp. I looked up at one of the officers, a look of pure shock and revulsion on my face. "Let me guess, you didn't know anything about it. Why don't you just save it for the interview?" he says. But I didn't. I swear to God I didn't. And I told the police who questioned me down at the station the exact thing when they asked me all sorts of things about human trafficking rings. I broke down in tears when they tried to get me to admit that I was the ringleader or something, and swore blind that I had no idea what they were talking about, and that I'd never do anything like that, and that I just didn't have it in me. Eventually, they let me go, satisfied that I didn't have anything to do with it, but I was horrified that something like that couldn't have been going on right under my nose, that I'd smiled and joked with some of the scumbags that had frequented that flat, completely unaware of the hellishly cruel things they'd been getting up to inside of it. I ended up moving back in with my mom and dad not long after. I just couldn't live in that place anymore, and I couldn't cope with looking for a new place, not with the intense paranoia of not knowing what was going on behind the closed doors all around me. So please, as much as it might go against all of your F the police mentalities, just call the police if you think something weird is happening like that near you, because it is our business. It's all of our business, and that decision might be the difference between someone's freedom and an existence of pure torture. I'm from a city in the northwest of my country called Gadranuns. It is a very beautiful place, Some call it the City of Flowers. I love Garanuns, but I cannot live there anymore. There are too many bad memories for me, and people accuse me of something which I am innocent of. You see, 8 years ago I lived next to a family called the Negromontes. They seemed like very nice people, but they did not have a lot of money since the man of the house, Jorge, could not find a job for some reason. It was spoken in our neighborhood that Jorge could not work because of an illness he had, but he had helped support his family by making and selling pastries to his neighbors, including myself. Jorge made the best empadas and salgados, which are traditional Brazilian pastries that we all love to eat, and on more than one occasion, I found him knocking at my door with a tray of delicious empadas for sale. They were very affordable and very delicious, and I know I am not the only one in our neighborhood who used to buy them very regularly from him. It felt good to be able to help him support his family like that. Some people said Jorge was mentally ill, but it seemed obviously to be that he had some kind of physical condition too. Sometimes, when Jorge called over at my apartment, he would burst out laughing for no reason at all, like he had heard someone tell a funny joke that only he could hear. Sometimes his arms seemed to shake when he held out the tray of empadas for me to look at, and one day he started having a nosebleed which dripped all over the pastries. He apologized a lot and seemed very nervous as he walked away from my door, but when I assured him it was okay and that I hoped that he would feel better soon, he broke into this high-pitched laughter as he disappeared around a corner. Jorge could act very strange like that, but I just felt sorry for him and kind of admired how determined he was to support his family like that by working hard at making delicious food. But one day, I came home from my job to see a few police cars outside the Negromonte house. All of the neighborhood had come out of their homes to see what was going on, and we were shocked when a forensics team showed up too. These are the police who wear the white overalls and masks, the ones who look for pieces of dead bodies when there had been a murder. There were many rumors about what the family had been doing, but we did not have to wait long to find out what was going on. The pictures were all over the newspapers one day, and everyone heard the story being told on the local radio and TV stations. Human remains had been found in the family's backyard, and they were identified as belonging to a local homeless girl named Jessica, who had gone missing some time before. The news reports told us that the Negromontes had apparently lured her into the house with lies that they were looking for a nanny to look after their young child, but had then killed her and buried it in the backyard. We were all shocked by the news, but as time went on, even more disturbing facts were made public regarding the murders. I remember the day that the police had a press conference with journalists from all over the country. They claimed to have found a 50-page book that had been written by Jorge that he had titled Revelations of a Schizophrenic. The book was all about how he claimed to have been hearing voices talking in his head about how he should kill women, how what he did was all part of some kind of terrible satanic purification ritual, and that he had a plan to purify the world and reduce its population. I found this to be extremely disturbing and upsetting, as I would never have imagined that Jorge could ever think like this. He always seemed like such a sweet person, but I guess I was wrong to think that. But somehow, as the weeks went by, we heard things that were somehow even worse, things that destroyed my life as I knew it. Forensics teams had analyzed the entire Negromonte house and discovered traces of the murdered woman's body tissue on cooking utensils used by the family. What's more, rather large chunks of flesh had been found to be missing from the bodies most recently buried in their backyard. Police could only come to one conclusion, that the family had been butchering the murdered women before cooking and eating their flesh. But what's more, rumors began to spread that not only had the family been practicing cannibalism, but they had actually sold some of the meat to the neighboring community in their empadas and salgados. It was horrifying to learn, as, of course, I had bought Jorge's pastries from him many times before, and not only had I eaten them, I thought they were very tasty. I remember sitting on my couch watching the TV when I heard the news. The room began to spin. I felt numb for a few moments, unable to properly compute the information that I had just heard, until it all became clear to me in one single horrible moment. I had eaten human flesh without my knowledge. I ran to the toilet and was violently sick. This was all traumatizing enough for me, but then rumors began to spread that the whole community was part of some satanic cult, and that we actually knew that we were eating it. People from all over the city came to our neighborhood to harass the people living there, including myself. Despite our denials, they called us all cannibals and told us that we were no longer welcome to live in Garununs. I personally had a note posted through my door from someone anonymous telling me that I would be killed in revenge if I did not leave the city. I didn't want to risk my life, so I left for the coastal city very far away from Garununs, where I currently live alone. I don't eat meat anymore. I am purely vegetarian because the taste of meat brings back horrible memories for me and makes me instantly sick every time I taste it. So, now you understand why I don't wish to give my name or give too much information as to where I live, as I'm afraid I'll be hunted by these people seeking vengeance for Jorge Negromonte's terrible crimes. But I swear to Jesus Christ I did not know what I was eating, and if I ever did, I would not have eaten it, and I would have reported Jorge to the police. So please, although you think you might know who your neighbors are, ask yourself, do I really know who I'm living next to? Do I really know what they're doing behind closed doors? Because for some of us, we don't know exactly who our neighbors are. Not until it's far too late. The whole sad mess started in May of 2011. I've been living in a 2-bedroom house next to campus for 2 years. No girlfriend to speak of and incredibly lonely. So when Rachel moved in next door, I was praying for a shot. I was so lonely, in fact, her 10-year-old son didn't scare me off. Being a tall, buxom redhead made her my dream girl. I say girl, but she was 30, a woman and almost 8 years older than me. Hellos and how are yous were shared each morning, and I did my utmost to keep her from noticing how creepy and awkward I really was. The way in which I fumbled over my words, as embarrassing as it was, didn't drive her away. As the months compounded, our talks became more personal and I less nervous. Before I knew it, she had asked me to take her out, and I agreed. I was still a poor student, but even with that, our dinner went well and we progressively drew closer and closer. Her son actually turned out to be a cool kid, and he and I would often play video games together. I did my best to not appear as if though I was trying to be a father to him, more of a friend, really. The situation did cause me to wonder why his father wasn't in his life. The possibility of him being dead did enter my mind, and I thought if I asked, it may bring up unresolved issues. The truth would turn out to be far worse. Things really hit the fan when her ex-husband arrived unannounced at her house. I wasn't there when he showed up, but the fight between the two clued me in. At the time, I was just waking up and heard yelling coming from across the street. I peeked through the blinds in time to witness him hitting her across the head and body. This instance would be the first of many and was the moment I knew what we had was over. Long ago, I learned the hard way to not get involved in an argument between partners. If you're lucky, you get out unscathed, but if you try to be the hero, the effort rarely gets rewarded. Even if she would have asked for help, I probably wouldn't have done it, but she never did. In fact, for the remaining time her and her son lived there, no words passed between the two of us. The ex would move in not long after and stayed until they moved out. A few times her and I would share a passing look, her eyes projecting an air of regret and apology, but nothing became of it. I made the choice to move in, just as she had. Many times more I would witness the abuse, and at least once she knew I had. No one was going to save her but herself. I did have one more brief conversation with her son. He let me know his father had returned home from jail and the whole family was about to move across town to a trailer park. This talk was probably more of a way to let me know what happened than a friendly goodbye. I thanked him and said a goodbye myself. They moved the next week, and that was the last time I saw either of them. Despite the overwhelming feeling of loss I carry with me, The truth is, she was always too good for me. An unconfident and shy boy was never a match for a beautiful young woman. At least, that's what I tell myself. No matter how brief our time together was, it was the best of my life, and I pray nightly I'll feel that joy again. I had a female neighbor as a kid. Her family was a little odd. They do very unsafe things like chuck throwing stars at each other. Normally the stars never struck one of them, except for this one time when the girl threw one at her younger brother and it stuck in the back of his forearm. It wasn't really deep, mind you, but it still was deep enough to not fall out when he moved the arm. Instead of freaking out like any sane 10-year-old would, he laughed and pulled the thing out. Rather than calling it quits for the day, he threw it back at her. For a while, I thought it was because they were half Japanese and that's just what they did, but as I grew up, I realized that they were just crazy people. When I was 16, the girl and I started messing around. I'm not sure how it happened. One day I was hanging out at their house and I realized I was attracted to her. Not long after, we happened to be wrestling around with each other and she pinned me down and began kissing me. It was all uphill from there. Some days, we'd only touch one another's bodies, and some days, it went all the way. We'd been doing our best to hide what we were doing, but one day, her older brother found out and decided to torture me for it. I never could get a straight answer from her on how he found out, but he had, and that was all that mattered. When he first approached me, I lied, but he saw right through me. Next, I began apologizing, but he still said nothing. His silence was terrifying, but not as much as the knife he was holding in his hand. At that moment, I was standing roughly 10 feet away from him. I eventually ran out of things to say, and we just stared at each other. The long seconds started to get to me, and I yelled at him to say something. Instead, he smiled, raised his hand, and threw the knife at me. I instinctively cowered and covered my head, but it sailed above me and hit the wall. There was no way I was going to stick around and become a pincushion, so I fled across the living room. He kept up his silent treatment. It was clearly working. I stopped to turn to look and see where he was. I saw him bend over and pick up the knife. When he'd seen I'd stopped, he threw it. Again. I saw what he was about to do and ran out the front door of the house. I didn't stop this time until I was inside my own house. As I ran into our living room, my mom stopped me and asked why I was running. It wasn't the first time I'd come running into the house, but I must have been horrified looking. I very nearly blurted out, but remembered what had initiated the chase in the first place. Telling my mom anything about what I'd been doing or even admitting I had those type of thoughts scared me much more than having sharp things thrown at me. So I told her I was very thirsty and was running into the kitchen to get a Coke. I'm not sure she believed me, but let it go and I slipped off to the kitchen. Later in the day, my playmate called me to come over, but I swore I'd never go over there again, as long as her brother was around. She didn't know what had happened until I explained it to her. I hoped she'd get mad about how I was treated. Instead, she changed the subject and said she'd come over to my house. It was a little harder to mess around at my place. My folks were always around. At least one of them. I was kind of mad she didn't stick up for me and obviously still shaken from nearly dying, but she was able to take my mind off of all of that rather easily. We took the opportunity to make up when my mom stepped out for a few things and we continued messing around any chance we had. I did stick by my pledge, however. I didn't step one foot in her house for the remainder of my time living with my folks. College came around in a few years, and other than small visits at holidays, her and I never saw each other after I left. I did run into her older brother during one Thanksgiving. Even though we were both adults now and many years had passed since our talk, the memory of it was still strong and I expected him to chuck a knife at me any second. Back when I was a law student at a prominent London university, I moved into a shared house in Peckham during the final years of my studies. Half the reason I was so keen on that particular house was that only one of the other apartments was occupied. The trouble with being in a student house is that they tend to be pretty rowdy places. You never know quite when someone is going to bring home a bunch of friends from a club night and spend the wee small hours blasting music in the kitchen or whatever. Obviously, that's not conducive for a good sleeping pattern, and the last thing I wanted was to mess up my important final year by living in some bloody party house. So with the help of some close friends, I moved all my stuff into the flat one morning with every intention of going upstairs to greet the person that lived on the top floor and the only other person living in the house. But at one point, as I'm moving some bags up the stairs, I looked up the stairwell and saw someone looking down at me with a cold, dull expression on their face. It was a guy, a rather tall one too, with short cropped blonde hair and very, very pale blue eyes. I mean, they were so pale it was like they shined out of his eye sockets at me, this rather alarming shade of icy blue. I said hi to him in as friendly a way as I could muster, but instead of returning my greeting, he just stared at me for a few moments before slowly backing away from the stairwell. Then I just heard a door slam as he disappeared back into his apartment. The person I was with just kind of gave me an awkward, amused look as we whispered our hopes that he wouldn't end up being a weirdo or anything like that. God, when I look back on it, it was such a hauntingly prophetic moment. If only we knew how right we were. The first few nights were nothing unusual, and I was actually relieved that I get the peace and quiet that I've been hoping for. That was until one evening when I'm sitting in my computer chair and doing some research on international trade law, and I heard something coming from the hallway outside. At first it didn't bother me too much, and I simply put on some ambient music that always seemed to help me concentrate and tried to ignore the sounds coming from outside. But as the night went on, they seemed to get louder and louder, and eventually I couldn't contain my curiosity, walking over to the door so I could get an idea of exactly what they were. It was the sound of screaming in particular, a woman screaming, and it was coming from the apartment upstairs. At first I thought the guy up there was just watching a horror movie or something, and that's what the screaming sound was from. But the longer I listened, the more I realized that whoever was up there was listening to that and only that, like to the point I could hear the audio file or whatever looping at a certain time. He was just up there, listening to the sound of a woman screaming in pain for like an hour straight. I know I should have just gone up there and asked him to turn it down, but the idea that he was just sitting in his apartment listening to the sound of a woman screaming for that length of time, my God, it scared the life out of me. It was hours before I was silent again. I'm talking like 1 a.m. before I could finally even think about getting to sleep. Questions were rolling around my mind as I was lying there in the dark. Like, what kind of person just listens to stuff like that for hours at a time? Or worse, what if he was watching something criminally violent? What if he was up there watching some kind of snuff film? I lay awake for hours, absolutely terrified of my new situation, one I couldn't just escape from so easily since I'd spent such a huge amount of money on the admin charges, first month's rent, and that sort of thing. I was so bloody worried, and it was with those thoughts echoing through my mind that I finally drifted off to sleep. I was absolutely exhausted during lectures the next day, to the point where my mates were asking me if everything was okay, since apparently I looked as rough as a bear. I told them I was fine, but that something was seriously weird about the bloke who lived upstairs. A few of them consoled me with tales of their own weirdo housemates, and that, as creepy as he seemed to be, at least he wasn't a perv who was constantly trying to get in my pants or whatever. And I suppose that, in a manner of speaking, they were right. But that night I just found myself getting pretty angry that this guy was so bloody inconsiderate, so I put on my big girl pants and marched up to his apartment with every intention of getting him to turn the volume down. So I rock up to his door, knocking on it loudly as I wait for him to answer. A little side note, I've dealt with noisy neighbors before. Usually the moment you knock, the noise turns down. They're embarrassed, apologetic, generally reasonable people. Only with this guy, the noises didn't turn down at all. I can't even describe how unnerving it was to hear what was coming from inside that apartment. I still don't know what those screaming sounds were from, be it a movie or a weird noisecore album or some other bollocks, but I'm telling you now, they sounded real. They were utterly blood-curdling, the kind of screams you only get out of someone when they know they're about to die. I was positively shaking with fear by the time I heard the door begin to unlock, and when it opened, what I saw was more unnerving than I could possibly imagine. The weird blonde guy that I had seen looking down the stairwell at me just a week or so before, well, I assume it was him anyway, was wearing a mask, one that I find hard to describe when I think about it. It was made of varnished wood, I know that, and it looked kind of like a death mask, like the cast of a person's face that's made when they've recently passed away. Only there was something horribly, horribly wrong with this mask. Something that sounds deeply unnerving. It was misshapen, warped, with indistinguishable words or symbols carved into it. But that's not what really freaked me out, because when he opened the door, he was also completely and utterly stark naked. I remember backing up on the spot, putting a bit of a distance between myself and the masked man before I asked him, in the politest way imaginable, if he would be so kind as to turn the music down just a little bit. He didn't even move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring back at me from the eye slits that had been cut into the mask. I just kept backing up, shifting my tone from polite request to outright apologetic that I'd been so rude as to disturb him. But still he didn't move. He didn't make a sound, he just carried on, staring at me. By the time I saw the scars that ran up and down his chest, I just ran back downstairs into my apartment and locked the door behind me, almost hyperventilating with fright as I called a friend who lived nearby and asked if I could stay at their place for a while. They were curious as to why I was so upset, and especially as to why I suddenly didn't want to stay at the flat that I'd previously been so made up with. But once I explained, they invited me around immediately and told me to stay as long as I wanted. From there, I contacted the police and made an indecent exposure complaint, but the officer I spoke to said that without any witnesses, it would be essentially my word against theirs and it was nothing to build a case on. They recommended that, as inconvenient and disappointing as it was, that it was best that I just stay away from this disturbed, masked neighbor person as much as possible. I ended up moving out of that flat as quickly as I could, going back with a few friends during the daytime to collect my things, and once again, the guy upstairs watching from up the stairwell, just staring again, completely emotionless. After that, I started to realize why the rest of the flats remained empty. I ended up graduating with a first in my law degree, and now I help run a law firm in the city of Birmingham. I remember my time in London well, but I tried never to think about that empty apartment building, ever again. Many of us will be familiar with the Bloody Mary urban legend. The idea that if you look into a mirror and say her name a certain number of times, a malevolent phantom known as Bloody Mary will materialize to murder you. Some might say that the movie series The Candyman borrowed the concept, having the protagonist stare into a mirror while repeating the titular character's name as a means to summon him. It's certainly a terrifying trope, the idea of staring into a mirror, only for someone or something to suddenly appear behind you. It's enough to make even the bravest of us shiver. But no one's ever just appeared out of someone's mirror to murder them, right? Those of you who wish to remain in blissful ignorance, I implore you, stop listening right now. But for the rest of you, who don't mind being a little paranoid for the next couple of days, let me introduce you to the story of Ruthie Mae McCoy. At around 8:45 on April 22nd of 1987, Ruthie Mae McCoy made a 911 call from her 11th floor Abbott apartment on West 13th Street, Chicago. After the police dispatcher asked Ruthie what manner of assistance she required, he found her response to be incredibly perplexing. In effect, Ruthie told them that someone was trying to get into her home via the bathroom cabinet. They want to break in, he asked. From where? They want to come through my bathroom, Ruthie replied. I'm on the other side. They're trying to reach in through my bathroom cabinet. The dispatcher had already established that Ruthie was on the 11th floor of a 13th Street high-rise. There was no way anyone was climbing through her bathroom window, and absolutely no way of them using her bathroom cabinet as some kind of doorway. The dispatcher was most certainly concerned for Ruthie's safety, but it seemed to them that the biggest threat to her well-being was herself. She sounded frightened, that much was certain, but if she truly believed that people were trying to break into her apartment through her bathroom cabinet, she must have been having some kind of mental breakdown. The dispatcher told Ruthie that the cops were on their way, but he logged the call as a disturbance with a neighbor as opposed to an assault in progress. It wasn't a high-priority call, but the cops would get there eventually to check up on her. When the cops finally arrived at Ruthie's apartment, they knocked on the door but received no reply. After their knocks went unanswered, the police attempted to enter the apartment using a key given to them by an attendant in the housing office, but left when the key failed to unlock the door. The next evening, Chicago PD received a call from one of Ruthie's neighbors who was worried about her whereabouts, considering she had seen police at her door the night before and still had not seen Ruthie. Chicago police and Chicago Housing Authority security guards arrived back at McCoy's apartment shortly afterward, and after the knocks and calls for McCoy went unanswered, officers suggested breaking the door down, but unbelievably, were prevented from doing so by the CHA security guards, who told them they'd sue the city for damages if they got fired from their jobs. The following evening, pressures from the cops forced the Chicago Housing Authority to act, and they sent over a representative with a carpenter, who drilled the lock on the door. It was then that they made a horrifying discovery: the dead, decaying body of Ruthie Mae McCoy. Homicide detectives discovered that she had been shot in her left shoulder, left thigh, the right side of her abdomen, and right upper arm. It also became obvious that whoever had shot Ruthie Mae was known to her and was able to gain access to her apartment without breaking and entering. Yet they discovered that Ruthie had locked her door from the inside and the key was still on its hook near the threshold. So how had they gotten in and out of the apartment? Detectives reviewed the 911 call Ruthie made on the night of her death. When she mentioned her killers trying to get in through the bathroom cabinet, a deep chill fell over the two men. It was impossible, like something out of a horror movie. But there had to be a rational explanation for what Ruthie was saying, as she was obviously not imagining anyone in her mirror. Detectives returned to the scene of the crime, intent on fully analyzing this bathroom cabinet that Ruth had mentioned. To the naked eye, it appeared to be a regular bathroom cabinet. Mirrored door, sterile white insides dotted with cosmetics and medicines. There were no secret doors inside of it, and there were certainly no supernatural portals to hellish otherworldly realms. In a show of mild frustration, one of the detectives either shook or struck the cabinet, only for each of them to notice something curious about it. It visibly shifted. We can imagine the moment. One detective silently looking at the other with surprise, before returning to shift the cabinet again. Before long, they discovered they could do more than just shift the thing. They could remove it entirely, revealing a gaping hole in the wall. As it turned out, the ABLA projects, which Ruthie called home, had a rather unusual architectural quirk built into it, in that certain apartments connected to one another via a narrow tunnel that ran behind the bathroom cabinets of opposite apartments. This design was intended to provide easy access to plumbing fixtures if maintenance was ever needed, and in some cases, apartments above and below each other were also connected by similar means. Granted, this made tradesmen's lives much easier, but also provided easier access for burglars and also nefarious types, as the bathroom medicine cabinets were easily removable from each end. A person could simply remove the cabinet from the wall of the apartment they were in, crawl through the narrow passage known as a pipe chase, and push in the cabinet of the unit they were trying to access. Break-ins via this method have been going on in the ABLA projects for quite a while by the time of Ruthie's murder, to the extent where residents would put furniture in front of their bathroom doors or tie them with rope before going to bed. It was obviously a huge problem, but one that was completely overlooked in the construction of the housing projects. Until the Chicago Housing Authority could find the money to fix it, residents were told to simply make do. Ruthie's apartment, number 1109, happened to be connected to number 1108, and this is obviously where her killers emerged from. Number 1108 was indeed being rented at the time, and it's believed that the tenant on record was actually a drug dealer who allowed his customers to use the apartment as a drug den. These shady drug-using types must have either entered or heard about the flaw in the architecture and decided to use it to their advantage. Two ALBA residents, Ted Turner, then aged 18, and 21-year-old named John Honduras, were charged with murder, home invasion, armed robbery, armed violence, and residential burglary. A number of witnesses claim they saw the two men carrying McCoy's 19-inch color TV and rocking chair around the projects in the hours following Ruthie's murder. After years of arrests and continual investigation, the charges against the two men were dropped due to lack of investigation, and the Ruthie's killers were never officially charged or imprisoned. Even without the supernatural element, the idea of someone being able to violently break into your apartment via what amounts to a secret passage is absolutely terrifying. Very few of us ever seen the blueprints to the apartment buildings or houses that we live in, and even fewer are actually interested in doing so. And so how do you know for certain that there isn't some kind of secret entrance to your apartment? And if there is, how do you know there isn't someone sneaking along it right this instant, ready to jump out on some poor unsuspecting scary story fan to give them their own personal horror story? The man born as Frank Ruchon would eventually go by Andre Rand during his adult life, but the name on his driver's license has become somewhat irrelevant, as his terrifying exploits would be attached to a deceptively playful nickname. Born in New York City on March 11th of 1944, Rand would spend most of his life around Staten Island, going on to be one of the most infamous criminals that the Northeast has ever known. And although Rand definitively wasn't the most prolific serial killer, it's more the nature of his crimes that made him so universally reviled. You see, Andre Rand's prey of choice was children. Thankfully, Andre Rand is currently serving several consecutive 25 years to life sentences, but the convicted kidnapper and suspected child serial killer managed to wreak enough havoc and inflict enough pain in his time that his capture and imprisonment provides very little solace. Yet bizarrely, the man's morbidly fascinating tale began as a real-world campfire story. In days gone by, young people all over the borough of Staten Island would scare the living daylights out of each other with descriptions of the monstrous figure known only as Cropsey, supposedly a sort of boogeyman figure with a razor-sharp steel hook for a hand. Cropsey would apparently drag innocent children from their homes in the middle of the night before carrying them to an abandoned hospital. There, depending on who was telling the story, you would be tortured, killed, eaten, or any combination of the three. Although creepy campfire and urban legends are a standard, a thrilling part of most everyone's early childhood, for the children of Staten Island, these ominous little tales soon became disquietingly real. The line between fact and fiction began to blur as local children began to vanish in real life, but when their cold, dead bodies were found, it made it clear that this was no mere campfire tale. Could it be that Cropsey was real? During the 1960s, Andre Rand was employed as a custodian at the Willbrook State School. Funded by state government, the Willowbrook was a charitable center that provided aid for children with disabilities. On the surface, all of the Willowbrook's practices were good and proper, but upon closer inspection, state officials began to unravel a web of questionable conditions and unethical medical practices. On the advice of the inspectors, the Willowbrook was immediately closed and Andre Rand was forced to find alternative employment. Rand had a clean slate. He could have pursued just about any manner of unskilled labor, but instead, he chose to pursue an even more horrifying career. Between the date of the Willowbrook's closing in the early 1970s, several young girls went missing in the area surrounding the abandoned hospital. The first was a 5-year-old Alice Piera. On July 10, 1972, the happy-go-lucky toddler seemed to simply vanish into thin air while playing in the street just outside her house, a street located just a few miles southeast of the old Willowbrook Hospital. For a while, the whereabouts of the small child remained a complete mystery. Yet there was something else the local townsfolk were unaware of, that Andre Rand once went by Frank Ruchon, and Frank Ruchon had once served 10 months in prison for the abduction of several small children. The fact he only did 10 months stems from the fact that his defense attorney managed to essentially haggle a judge down to a conviction of false imprisonment, a crime with a considerably lower penalty than kidnap or abduction. But the conviction was enough to smear Frank's name for good, and so he came up with a rather simple and cunning solution. He changed it, and after moving out to Staten Island, became Andre Rand. Yet as much as Rand could hide his identity from the townsfolk, he couldn't hide his identity from police officers who were well aware of his legal change of name. So when little Alice Pereira went missing on that warm July evening, the police considered Rand to be the prime suspect. Despite their convictions, evidence was flimsy and not nearly enough to gain a solid conviction in a court of law. And so, as the cops chose to hold their horses, the bodies began to pile up. On July 15, 1981, 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes went missing. Her parents filed a missing persons report, while several witnesses claimed to have seen the girl with Rand shortly before her disappearance. Once again, no actual evidence led to no actual arrest. 2 years later, Rand once again became the prime suspect when 11-year-old Tyhees Jackson disappeared. Then in 1984, 21-year-old Hank Gaffario vanished. These unnerving incidents left the nearby townsfolk racked with terror, a terror that was exacerbated by the fact that not a single person was apprehended, with all at a loss for a potential motive. It was a whopping 3 years before local law enforcement finally caught a break in their investigation, when 12-year-old girl Jennifer Swagger was reported missing on July 9th of 1987. The search for her, or her body, lasted 35 days, and ended in the traumatic unearthing of her body in a wooded area on Staten Island. According to the New York Times, Swagger was found dead in a shallow grave on the former property of the Willowbrook State School. By the time Jenny Swagger's body was found, police decided they had to act, and Andre Rand was arrested and charged as a suspect in the murder. Once again, prosecutors fell afoul of court procedure and found they were unable to convict Rand on the murder charge, with there only being enough evidence to irrefutably convict him of kidnapping. This was 1988. Prosecutors had Rand exactly where they wanted him, in a federal penitentiary, where he'd stew while they worked on convicting him of the other child murders. Although there wasn't enough evidence at the time, Rand was found guilty of Holly Ann Hughes' kidnapping in 2004, over 2 decades after she originally went missing. And since there is no statute of limitations for New York for first-degree kidnapping, prosecutors ensured that Rand wouldn't escape justice for his historic depravities. He was given an additional 25 years to life sentence on top of the one he was already serving. All in all, the Staten Island boogeyman sits behind bars to this day for the kidnappings of Holly Ann Hughes and Jennifer Swagger, and won't be eligible for parole until 2037, provided he lives that long. He'll be 93 years old on the day he walks free. Andre Rand's disturbing life and legacy were dissected in the 2019 documentary movie Cropsey. The film premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival that year and won the Grand Jury Prize for its enthralling narrative and slick production quality. And on watching it, it's easy to see why. The essential premise of the movie was to explore whether or the Staten Island urban legend of Cropsey was actually tied into Rand's murderous career. Whether one had fed into the other until fact and fiction had become indistinguishable. Yet as the movie came to show, for some of the people who experienced those years on Staten Island, as well as those involved in searching for the missing kids, the term boogeyman didn't even broach Rand's despicable psychopathy. Donna Coutinho, president of the charity Friends of the Jennifer for Missing Children, calls Rand the Hannibal Lecter of Staten Island. Donna and her fellow volunteers have the unenviable task of searching all over Willowbrook's 385 acres twice a year in search of any undiscovered remains. He terrified a whole community, and he still haunts us, Donna was quoted as saying. For some kids, it's like if Corpsey was real. What else aren't they telling us, you know? And I don't know. Sometimes I feel a little of that too. At the end, Andre Rand was arrested, imprisoned, and may never see the light of day again. But nevertheless, his impact on the Staten Island community is immeasurable, and Cropsey has left behind massive psychological trauma that may well last for generations. Some of those children are still missing. The remains are still out there, somewhere. And as the years go by, and their bones are pulled one by one from the cold earth, entombing them, the memories of Rand's reign of terror will come back flooding, over and over again. And maybe that's what makes the Cropsey story so well and truly terrifying. That the core lesson in the story, the frightful foundation of its message, is that the boogeyman is real, and he wears the faces of men. Perhaps you've heard of the urban legend sometimes known as the dead body under the bed. The legend tells of a vacationing couple that checks into a seedy roadside motel only to discover a foul smell in their room. Come night, they find the smell to be so odorous that they're unable to sleep and decide to call a member of staff to complain. This staff member then discovers that the smell is in fact coming from the bed, and looks under the frame to find the couple had been sleeping on top of the rotting body of a young girl that had been stuffed into the box. It's definitely one of the lesser-known urban legends, but it's one made all the more terrifying by the fact that it's actually a true story. Not only that, but there have been multiple occurrences of people sleeping in rooms where dead bodies have been concealed. And two of those unfortunate souls were James and Rhonda Sargent. The couple had been on the road for hours before they checked into room 222 of the Budget Lodge Inn on Brooks Road in Memphis, Tennessee. That evening, the couple said they complained to the motel staff that the room was stanky and foul. They burned some incense they picked up from a nearby hippie hole, but it seemed like nothing could cover the revolting odor. Though it seemed that someone had apparently tried before, because the sergeants noticed there were fabric softener sheets stuffed into ceiling tiles and nooks, and the smell was strongest whenever anyone sat on the bed. It was perhaps the worst night's sleep of their entire lives, and in the morning, the couple left the motel, determined to never darken its doors again. Sometime later, the smell had attracted some negative attention that the motel owners finally decided to call the police. More than one guest had commented that it smells like a dead body in there, in room 222, and they weren't wrong. Homicide detectives instantly recognized the smell as belonging to a corpse, and after turning the room upside down, located the moldering cadaver of 28-year-old mother of four, Soni Millbrook. Throughout the course of the police investigation that followed, it was discovered that Soni had checked into the Budget Inn sometime in January of 2010. She was staying with her boyfriend and father of 4 of her children, Lakeith Moody, and the room was in his name. Millbrook had been there for a couple of weeks when one day in late January, she did not pick up her kids from daycare. Her sister, Linda James, reported her missing. Police believe she died the day she vanished, but were told by motel workers that they had bagged up Millbrook's personal belongings and cleaned the room. The workers said nothing appeared amiss and the room was rented out. If Sony had indeed been a victim of foul play, it certainly hadn't been the Budget Inn, or at least so it seemed. After Sony's body was found, Lakeith Moody was stopped while driving Millbrook's car and was arrested on federal charges of being a felon in possession of a gun. It took until his trial in 2014 for him to be convicted of murdering the mother of his child, and he was automatically given a life sentence in accordance with state law. I'm just a shock because I'm like, okay, I done laid on top of this lady's body, said Rhonda Sargent, who stayed in the room after Millbrook disappeared, before her body was found. This is somebody's daughter, someone's mom. Why didn't they investigate this fully? I think I would have searched all over, her husband James added. I think I would have known to look up under the bed. Yet he didn't, and neither did the police. It was already clear. Talk about ruining a crime scene, Memphis Police Director Larry Godwin said in March. It had also been rented several times with next to no complaints. It was like, well, we don't have any evidence here. The officers wanted to solve it, and so they went in a different direction. Whether or not there was misfortune, or simply incompetence on the part of investigating police, it's impossible to judge. But what things remain clear, that an alarming number of people have actually slept on beds under which a body had been concealed. So next time you're on the road, and you stop to spend the night at a roadside rest stop, make sure there's nothing masking any particular nasty smells. And as always check under the bed, as apparently you know really well when you'll be sleeping with an unexpected roommate. Ironically, one of the most horrifying true urban legends is perhaps one of the least known, at least in the US anyway. Because up in Toronto, Canada, almost everyone has heard the story of the Leaping Lawyer. According to the story, one well-to-do lawyer was overly keen on showing off all the features of his extravagant office space. Set into a huge glass skyscraper, the firm who made the huge plate glass windows of the office boasts that their windows were unbreakable, and that it would take a shot from an artillery gun to successfully shatter them. Apparently, this well-to-do lawyer was a fan of proving them right, and had a rather terrifying office party trick that he often used to wow his guests. Right when the party was in full swing, he would take a running jump at the plate glass windows after announcing, "Goodbye, cruel world." Those in attendance would scream in horror as the lawyer leapt towards the window, only to be met with his hysterical laughter when he harmlessly bounced off the toughened, polished glass. Over and over, the lawyer repeated his death-defying stunt, until one day, the unthinkable happened, and the unbreakable broke. The lawyer reeled up, ran at the glass, thrilled by the accompanying screams of the uninitiated. But as his large, speeding body came in contact with the glass, it shattered, and instead of turning around to laugh at those who had fallen for the prank, the lawyer was only met with the sound of his own screams as he plummeted 20 stories down to his death. It's an urban legend that has everything. The impossible is possible, the arrogant are punished, and it's about as theatrical as urban legends get. Yet perhaps the real horror only comes when we learn that the entire story is completely and utterly true. After completing an engineering degree before attending law school, Gary Hoy took a job practicing corporate and securities law in the eastern Canadian city of Toronto. He worked for a firm known as Holden Day Wilson, a law firm located on the 24th floor of the Toronto Dominion Center. Then, on July 9th, 1993, Hoy happened to notice someone giving a tour of the office to a group of articling students from a nearby university. Like he had done many times before, he attempted to demonstrate the strength of the structure's window glass by slamming himself into a window. So, in order to give the students a good fright, Hoy took his usual run-up and slammed into the plate glass. This is where the urban legend differs from the true story, as it turns out the glass was indeed unbreakable and remained unshattered even on the day of Hoy's death. Instead, some rusty old screws, tired of Hoy's continual abuses, simply dislodged and allowed the window pane to slip out of place. Right there, in front of the completely unsuspecting students, Gary Hoy screamed as he slipped through the gap in the floor and the window, plummeting 24 stories to his death. The building's structural engineer Bob Greer was contacted by the Toronto Star for comment. When he learned of Hoy's folly, he was quoted as saying, "I don't know of a single building code in the entire world that would allow a 160-pound man to run up against a window like that. He must have been out of his freaking mind." In another interview, the glass company who made the panes was quick to state that the windows didn't actually break. "We just want to make that clear. It popped out of its frame. That's what caused Mr. Hoy to fall. Shoddy workmanship, not our product." Holden Day Wilson never recovered from Hoy's death, and it was definitely one of the factors that contributed to the firm's eventual closure less than 3 years later. At the time, it was the largest law firm closure in Canadian history, but national newspapers seemed to forget that Hoy's death even occurred. The firm's closure was blamed on mismanagement and financial discrepancies, and the fact that Gary's ghost had haunted all those that had witnessed his death was totally ignored. Maybe that's because the story became so frequently mentioned in fictional media, referenced so heavily on TV and in film, that people just assured it was the fabrication of some overly imaginative writer. And we can understand why. The tale is truly a horrifying one, something we'd rather tell ourselves didn't happen rather than facing the bone-chilling truth that a man really did end up taking his own life, all because of a dumb prank.
When I was 9, I was staying home alone. It was early morning, and I had just gotten out of the shower and brushed my teeth. I put on my favorite outfit, set up a little area in the living room with a drink and a snack, and then turned on the TV to watch something. The phone rang. I went across the house to go answer it. The voice on the other end was, well, really familiar and really comforting for me. He asked me about my day so far, and he made small talk. After about a minute or so, he then said,
"I like your outfit. Is pink your favorite color?"
I replied back with, "Oh, thank you. No, it isn't."
"What were you planning on watching on TV?"
he asked. It took me a few seconds to understand what was happening, as I was only 9 years old and very naive. The voice on the other end of the phone then changed. It became deep and raspy and horrific. The voice then proceeded to describe all these horrible things that they wanted to do to me, and in detail. I went numb. My skin felt as if it were on fire, and my heart was racing. I had never been more terrified in my entire life. I slammed down the phone, and then I called my mom at work. I tried to explain what happened, and I'm not sure I was making much sense. She got on to me for answering the phone, and she told me to go back about my day. I remember trying to explain to her that he was watching me, and that he told me what I had been doing, and that he knew what I was wearing. I also mentioned that I was going to call 911 because I needed help. "That isn't necessary. I'm not coming home. Just don't answer the phone and go watch TV," she said, and then I hung up. I was really confused and I was scared. I could feel his eyes on me. I pulled the curtains closed and I raced around the house, torn between doing what I felt was right and doing what I had been told by my mother. This whole time the phone was ringing. The second it would stop, it would just start up yet again. The sound of the phone ringing would pulse through my entire body like electricity. It was practically paralyzing me. It was like I was frozen but also on fire at the same time. I waited for a pause in the ringing and called 911. "I'm home by myself and I'm 9 years old and someone's watching me and telling me they're gonna kill me," I told the operator. She tried to keep me calm and she said that she would send help for me. I remember standing there listening to this kind voice just trying to help me, but I could feel every scary movie scenario just playing out behind me. Was he creeping up behind me with a knife? Was he going to shoot me through a window? Was he going to throw a rock through the glass and open the door? I just didn't know. I couldn't breathe and I couldn't feel my body. In a moment of panic, I set off the alarm to the house and ran outside. I remember this sense of relief, but also this overwhelming feeling of having a separation in my reality. The house felt small and dark and really dangerous and cold. Outside felt open, as well as safe and warm. I could hear lawnmowers and the sounds of birds chirping. It was a beautiful break from that bone-chilling feeling of the phone. It was like I was watching a movie and I could see myself experience both of these environments at the same time. A neighbor was pushing his child in a swing. He was concerned. He let me stand next to him and he protected me. I could hear the sirens now, the blaring sound getting louder as they grew closer. It felt like it took an eternity, but the police finally arrived. An officer walked over to me and he asked me what happened. I did my best to explain it, but so many of the words on the phone that were used were just so embarrassing. I couldn't bring myself to use such adult words to a police officer. And his other words were just bone-chilling. I couldn't say those either. To this day, I can still hear my young voice repeating the words. He was watching me. He said he was going to kill me. Not long after, my mom's car pulled into the driveway. She, for some reason, decided to come home. She didn't look for me or come to speak to me. She just calmly got out and then walked over to the police officer. I was standing in the doorway from the house to the garage just facing the driveway. I could see my mom and the police officer. I was watching and trying to understand, trying to figure out what was happening. Then I saw it. She was laughing. My face was swollen from tears, my heart still racing, and my skin was on fire. And my mom was laughing? What the hell was going on? Very slowly, I crept a little closer, and I then overheard. "I'm so sorry about this. I guess she just got scared being home alone and overreacted. I'm really sorry. What the hell's happening? What did I do wrong? Did I imagine this? Was this a dream? Should I not have called 911? Did I actually overreact?" My memory of what happened after that is a little hazy. I remember refusing to stay home alone and the sound of the phone ringing just rippling through my body. It wasn't something I liked discussing. I refused to repeat what had been said to me by the voice on the phone. My mom decided that she knew who did it, but she didn't even know the details. There was no investigation. No one was questioned. She told me it was a boy who was the same age as me who lived across the street. I knew that was impossible, but no matter how much I protested it, I was always told that it was him. Many years later, after I was an adult with my own children, we were at Christmas. Everyone was in the living room and I had gone into the back bedroom to change a diaper. As I was walking out of the room and back into the living room, I could hear my mom laughing, her voice as if she had been telling a joke. The faces of everyone else in the room told a different story. Discomfort, anguish, shock, fear, yet she was still laughing. It felt as if I was walking in slow motion. One of my older children had actually stopped me from entering the living room and sort of pushed me back into the room that I had just come out of. She just told the story of you being home alone and the man threatening to kill you. She told it like it was a joke or something. Like some funny story from your childhood, my child told me. To this day, I never learned who it was that called me. I deal with my fear of ringing phones and phone conversations on a daily basis. It's awful. So I'm 16 years old now and living in a duplex with my family. which consists of 3 younger brothers all under 5, my 18-year-old sister, and my mother and father. About 3 years ago, when we lived in our old apartment, I was home alone for the entire day. This was pretty normal as my father worked in the summer. My mom would take the kids out to do things like swimming and other things like that. I usually just slept in, and I had a small list of chores that I had to do during the day before everyone came home. One of those happened to be laundry. The way that the apartment is set up is on each level there's about 20 places where people live, and only one laundry room shared amongst us. I lived a few doors down from it, and I had to pass the door to the stairs in order to get to it, which that door had a little window. I was going to throw the clothes from the washer into the dryer when I then heard a clicking noise. I wasn't really sure what it was, but for a second I decided to listen before it then stopped. I was always really freaked out from that apartment, and this definitely wasn't helping. I finished throwing the laundry into the dryer and then started it. Then I started walking down the hall when I then heard that same clicking noise yet again. I froze. It sounded like it was coming from the stairwell. So as scared as I was, I looked out the window, and to my surprise, I didn't see anyone. Really relieved, I booked it down the hall to my apartment. I closed and locked the door, going about the day again, or so I tried. When it's quiet in that apartment, you can really hear everything. Conversations, footsteps, laughing, everything, especially from the hallway, and that's where the most crap was heard. I was in the kitchen feeding my animals when I heard slow, heavy footsteps in the hall. It sounded like they were coming down the hall right outside of the apartment. I decided to run to the living room and mute the TV so that I could listen, when I then heard 3 loud bangs at my door. I was kind of crapping my pants at this point, not really knowing what to do. I kept the TV muted and slowly moved my way to the door, looking out the peephole. I was horrified at what I saw. It was a black figure standing with its back towards me. I didn't know what to do, and I was frozen in place. And then, I then heard a familiar sound. That same bizarre clicking sound that I heard before. I noped the hell out of there and grabbed my animals, then hid in my room. I mean, I was really scared, but I was starting to wonder if it was really nothing. I usually listen to scary stories just like these to scare the crap out of me, but maybe something was actually there. Later in the evening, when my sister arrived home, I told her about what I saw because she's really into supernatural things like that. When I told her what I saw, the color from her face ran away. She said something along the lines of seeing that same figure, but in dark rooms and hallways, not lit ones. The next time I encountered it, I was sleeping on the bottom bunk and my sister in the top. The clock read 3:37 a.m., the fan was going, and the nightlight was plugged in. My sister was sound asleep at this point. I heard the clicking again, but this time quieter and from under the bed. One of my cats on my bed didn't seem to notice it, so I figured maybe I was just imagining it. That was until I then noticed a long black, bony cold arm then reach out and start making its way right up to my bed. I then yelped, enough to wake up my sister, but no one else. Pretty groggily, she just tells me to shut up and that she's trying to sleep. "But you gotta see this," I say as I look down and notice the thing's gone now. I didn't catch an ounce of sleep that night. I have lots of other terrifying stories from that hellhole apartment, but I think most of them revolve around that thing. Ever since I moved, I haven't had anything weird happen since. I'm just really glad that thing never followed me to my new house. Thank God for that. One night I was watching The Conjuring at home with my little sister when we heard someone putting a key in our front door, as well as opening it. We were sitting in the living room next to a sliding door that was also very close to the front door, so we both heard it very clearly. Now, this didn't really alarm us since we knew that our dad had recently gone out to get some things, so we kinda just assumed that maybe he had returned. "Dad, you're back already?" I casually asked. There was no response. Dad, are you there?" I asked yet again, thinking he hadn't heard me the first time, Once again, just silence. Right at this point, I'm starting to get the feeling that something isn't quite right, and I could tell by the look on my sister's face that she was just as nervous as I was. We started to look at each other for a brief moment, wondering what we should do, before we started hearing a few more scattering sounds from right outside the sliding door. By this stage, I was frozen in fear. I tried one more time in a louder but shakier voice. "Dad, is that you?" But the silence continued. Now at this point I'm freaking out and I literally jump right off the couch. My sister also abruptly gets up and starts rapidly walking to the other end of the room, which leads to the kitchen area. She later revealed to me that she was planning on grabbing a knife. She had this horrified look on her face that I hadn't ever seen before. We just looked at each other in nervous silence. I didn't really know what to do and I didn't want to make any further sounds. I finally decided to walk up to the sliding door and began opening it as slowly as possible, now peering into the darkness. When the door was finally open wide enough, I poked my head out and scanned the corridor, now preparing for the worst. To my surprise, there was no one there, but what was more strange was that the front door was still completely shut. My sister and I were obviously both extremely relieved, as we were almost certain that there was an intruder in our house. After this, I immediately went to go and ask my mom if it was her or whether she had noticed anything. She told me that she thought my dad had come home as well, and she also heard someone opening the front door. Around a half an hour later, which felt like an eternity at the time, as we were still quite shaken from the incident, my dad finally arrived home and he confirmed to us that he hadn't returned home earlier. To this day, my sister and I still have no idea what happened that night, and I guess we never will. Back in May of 2013, I had moved out of my parents' house and into an apartment community. As I was moving in the very first day, I had heard some loud thumping from the apartment above me. I had hoped it was just a fluke and that the people above me just happened to be doing something loud at the time, but over the next few months, it just got worse. They would very frequently make really loud thumping noises and slam things down, sometimes even causing the room to vibrate a little. I really have no idea what they could have possibly been doing that would be so noisy. I would often hear them screaming and arguing with each other at all times during the day and night. It also wasn't uncommon for them to have a shouting match at 1 a.m. I reported them to the apartment manager, but she didn't seem to take my complaint very seriously, and then brushed me off, saying she'd look into it. I was already locked into my lease for at least a year, so she didn't have much incentive to do anything as long as nothing serious happened. She only cared about collecting rent, rather than providing a good community for the residents. I was completely ready to take matters into my own hands, and then confront them about their late night fights. But then the situation took a really dark turn. Things went from annoying to creepy when one night the couple had started threatening each other. I heard the guy shout out, "You walk out that door and you'll never come back." And then the girl shouted back, "Get out of my way." That's when I then heard a loud thud and what sounded like glass breaking. Then I heard hurried footsteps walk out the building and the door to the outside open and slam shut. It was eerily quiet after that. Even though it was well past midnight, my curiosity really got the better of me, and I walked out my door and into the hallway. I climbed up the stairs to the apartment above me, and I saw the door still open. The guy noticed me looking in and then walked up to me. "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" he asked harshly. I heard some noise and yelling. "Everything all right?" I replied. "Yeah, everything's fine. Mind your own damn business." He then just slammed the door right in my face. I kinda just stood there for a few seconds, wondering if I should call the police or not. I decided not to because there really wasn't anything I could tell them, and I was kind of afraid of how this guy might react to his downstairs neighbor calling the police on him. I walked back down the stairs and into my apartment. Things were rather quiet from above over the next few days. I had hoped that his girlfriend had left her obviously unstable boyfriend for good, and that would be the end of it. Unfortunately, I just wasn't that lucky. A couple of nights later when I was sleeping, I had heard a noise coming from the outside hallway that woke me up. I heard some loud footsteps coming up the stairs. I got out of bed and walked over to my door and looked out the peephole. At first I saw nothing. Then I saw two men walk down the stairs and then stop to discuss something for a few minutes. I'd got a really uneasy feeling about them as it was late at night and I'd never seen them before. The door leading to the outside is permanently locked and can only be opened with a key, so either someone had let them in or they had a key. But who were they and why were they here? Then they walked out of the building. It was odd seeing this, but I didn't think much of it and just went back to bed, just really relieved that they were gone. But not 10 minutes later, I had heard those same footsteps yet again. I was still awake and I walked over to the peephole. Those same two men had returned. I saw the guy who lived above me walk down to greet them. I couldn't hear what they were talking about, but they had started to raise their voices with them. Then one of them grabbed the guy and then slammed him against the wall. It was right next to my apartment door, so I heard the loud thud of his body banging against my wall and then him shouting, "Hey, let go of me!" I quickly got down and then backed away from my door, as I didn't want them to notice me looking through the peephole. My heart was beating in fear as I heard the guy scream in pain as one of the men punched him. Then one of them shouted, "If you ever come near my sister ever again, I'll cut your throat." The guy pleaded once again for them to let him go, but they slammed him against my wall yet again. I then heard them walk down the stairs and out of the building. I kinda just sat there crouched down for a few minutes, in total shock as to what had happened. I literally just witnessed my upstairs neighbor get assaulted and then have his life threatened by two thugs right outside my door. When I finally got back up, I looked out my peephole and nobody was there. I tried to go back to sleep, but I was too on edge. I just laid there in bed, afraid those guys might come back, and wondering once again if I should call the police. I decided not to call them since I really didn't want to get involved in a dispute between my upstairs neighbor and two dangerous men that had assaulted him and also threatened to kill him. Thankfully, he moved out shortly after that incident, and there wasn't any more trouble with those guys. I moved the hell out of there as soon as my lease expired, as I didn't feel safe living there after that night. And again, the apartment manager clearly didn't care about the community she was in charge of. I've since bought my own condo, and I'm forever grateful that I'll never have to deal with upstairs neighbors ever again. Hearing someone get attacked right outside your apartment door and then have his life threatened right in front of you, well, that's something you just never forget. This happened when I was 13. I lived in a duplex with my dad and brother. It was a 2-bedroom and I shared a room with my dad while my older brother had his own room. It wasn't that uncommon for both of them to have plans at night while I stayed home to play video games, and alone. This night was no different. My dad was probably at some bar, and as for my brother, who really knows where he was? I was playing the original Resident Evil on PlayStation, and at around midnight, my eyelids were getting really heavy, and I decided to go to bed. I had slept with my bedroom door wide open. Now, not one time in the years that we lived in this place did my dad or brother ever come home by entering through the back sliding glass door. There were a couple of times where my brother didn't have his key for one reason or another, and he knocked on my bedroom window to ask me to let him in. My dad always had his key though, and he would always come through the front door. On this night in question, I had heard the back door slide open. It was an old door, and sliding it open wasn't really that easy. It was also very loud, so I heard it crystal clearly. I lay in bed absolutely wide-eyed, my imagination going crazy. I heard whoever it was walk through the dining room, then through the kitchen, and then into the living room. They had made no attempt to be quiet. After a brief silent pause, I saw someone walk by my bedroom doorway. This scared the living hell out of me, as you can imagine, and my heart throbbed. Whoever was in my house walked into the bathroom that was right next to my bedroom, then flipped the light on. The light poured into my bedroom, and I was just laying there, absolutely terrified, completely exposed by the light from the bathroom. You're probably wondering why I didn't shout for my brother or my dad. Well, because like I mentioned earlier, I knew it wasn't them, and there was no one else that it could have been that would have made sense to me. Not a family member, and definitely not a friend. I just knew that it was someone that didn't belong. The person then walked out of the bathroom, left the light on, then went into my brother's room and started making a ton of noise. It sounded like they were searching for something. All I did was lay there shivering. After a few more minutes, the person walked by my bedroom again. I expected at any moment that a stranger would then walk into my room, but they didn't. I heard them making noise in the living room, walking around huffing and puffing. Then they started walking back and forth right by my bedroom repeatedly, into the bathroom and then back out, over and over. At the time, I was 100% sure they were messing with me for some reason. They knew I was there, whoever they were. I heard the person making noises. By this, and by the really huge figure that I saw walking back and forth, I knew it was a man. They continued walking around each room except for the one I was in, and then suddenly I heard them walk back through the house to the back sliding door, open it, and then leave. I lay there in bed terrified, just wondering what the hell just happened. After a while, out of sheer exhaustion, I fell asleep. In the morning, I found that my dad and brother were home. I have asked the both of them dozens of times, but they both promised me that it wasn't them. Plus again, why the hell would they go through the back door, then leave again through the back door? This was about 21 years ago. I'll never know who it was or why they were there. Nothing was missing either. What really makes me wonder to this day is why the hell they never came into my bedroom. I mean, the door was wide open and they walked by it at least 20 times. It just doesn't make sense. I was about 21 or 22 years old at the time and living by myself. I had left my window open on a really pleasant night. It was low enough to the ground that you could get in if you really tried, but the screen wasn't easy to take off. And I did live in a fairly safe neighborhood, so I didn't even think twice about it. I woke up in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke, and I reached out to turn on my lamp, and my hand then hit what was very obviously a person. My brain fully woke up at that point, and I realized there was a shirtless man right in my bedroom smoking a cigarette and staring at me. I remember yelling for him to get out of my room, and I must have spooked him just as badly as he spooked me, because he leapt out of my window and took off after that. I slammed it shut, then moved a bookcase in front of it, and when I went out the next morning in the daylight, I found the screen sitting against the house. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and I haven't slept with the window more than having it cracked ever since. I also absolutely refuse to live on the ground floor of a building. I don't know if he was planning to rob me or what, but it was absolutely terrifying, and it really makes me wonder how many times it happened and I didn't wake up. It was scary. This happened a few years ago. My parents were both working out of the city. My siblings weren't home because they had to go to school that day, so I was left home alone. I was playing some games on the main PC in the house that's right in the living room. My parents never allowed me to have electronic devices in my room. They trusted me to stay home alone with all the rules of not picking up the phone or opening the door when someone knocks or when someone rings the doorbell. While I was playing games, I had heard the sound of my front door then opening. I was confused because my parents weren't to be home anytime soon. I checked the door and it was wide open, but there wasn't anyone there. I yelled for my mom and dad, but no answer. I texted the both of them, but they said they were still at work. I got a bit creeped out, but I thought they forgot to lock the door and maybe the wind opened it or something. I just decided to go back to the computer that I was playing games on, that is, until I heard a noise coming from my room. I got really frightened, but my stupid young self just decided to check it out to see what the noise was. I checked the bathroom first, but I then heard a zipper opening and closing. I didn't have a closet at the time since mine had recently had to go because there was mold behind it. I looked into my room, but everything seemed fine. I got a little closer to my temporary closet and opened it a bit. Once I opened the closet, my heart started pounding. There was a man holding a knife in my closet. I ran to my living room, shut my bedroom door, and took the house phone. I ran outside with the keys to lock the person in the house. I called the police and they were able to arrive shortly after. They looked through the house and they found the person trying to look for me all over the house. Since there was no way that he could have gotten out, he got arrested. I still get nightmares about this traumatic moment. What if I didn't hear them and I just went to sleep that night? Would I be dead? Who knows, but the thought of that absolutely terrifies me to this day.
It was a boring summer night. I just finished my school year and had a lot of time on my hands. My days were spent skateboarding with my friends at the park. Skating was my passion at the time, and virtually all of my free time was spent doing it. But some evenings, however, I found myself bored and at home. I was never much of a gamer, so watching my favorite series was my favorite pastime. But let's face it, even your favorite activities get boring after several days of doing them. But one night in particular, I was thinking back on a conversation with a friend. My friend used to go on the website Omegle and try and prank people. He often would pretend like he was a girl by putting on very well-made makeup by his sister. Due to his young face, he looked like an actual girl. This rather effective catfishing got some really funny reactions. Boys on the other side of the screen would sometimes get aroused and compliment him. After toying with them a little, he would reveal his real gender by showing his manly, deep voice. These stories my friend told were hilarious, so much so that I decided to try out Omegle myself. At first, I was genuinely bent on meeting people online and seeing where it would take me. I was also expecting to hopefully meet some cute girls from my area. I know it seems cliche and over-romanticized, but I was a lonely man during this time. I'd never been in a legitimate relationship before. I wanted to fall in love with someone. I wanted to care about someone. Sadly, Omegle disappointed me rather quickly. Every time I tried to make any conversation with someone, they would skip me. Sometimes I couldn't even say a word. I came to the conclusion that maybe they were only looking for girls on this page. After all, every other dude had their pants down and were showing their privates to the camera. I was shocked and disgusted at first, but after 10 times of seeing something, you tend to get used to it. But at this point, it was 11 p.m. I decided to skip the last few people and just call it a day. But when I was about to do this, I encountered something I really didn't expect to see on my screen. The first thing I noticed was a large table with guns spread across it. Behind it, a weird-looking man. My heart rate started rising. I counted around 6 guns on the table. What was happening? Why would someone just show their guns like this on Omegle? They had to be fake, right? While I asked myself this, I focused my attention to the man. His room behind him was pitch dark. I couldn't see anything but him and the guns. The man was sitting still behind his table, eyes wide open. He had long black hair, and his whole outfit was dark too. He was in some sort of goth-type outfit. Even the skin around his eyes were painted black, almost like some sort of clown or Joker, but with grayscale. His lack of movement was starting to play on my anxiety, but somehow I waited for him to start the conversation. After a long and awkward minute of staring at each other, he finally started to type something on his keyboard under his table. Curiosity would be an understatement to what I felt right now. I was really intrigued for some reason. What could this guy possibly be typing? The text read, "Hello, I choose you to choose my destiny. We will be playing the notorious game called Russian Roulette, but this version's a little tweaked. On my table here, I have 6 guns. 2 of them are fully loaded, and the rest are empty. You will decide which gun's trigger I should pull aiming to my head. We will do this twice, and if I survive, I win. If not, you win." I laughed out loud reading this message. I'm no expert, but the guns were clearly fake. He was trying really hard to make me believe in this prank. Thinking back to one of my friend's stories on Omegle, he also mentioned people doing stuff like this. So at this point, I immediately knew this was an act. And from my angle, the guns didn't seem glossy enough at all to look like actual metal. They seemed like they were made of plastic for some reason. Knowing all this, I proceeded. I was bored and I wanted to see how far this guy would take it. Would he actually fake his own death? So I looked through the guns and decided to pick the one on the left. I messaged him this and he picked that gun. I was more excited and intrigued than freaked out. I was curious to see how far this guy would take his performance, if you will. He then showed the gun to the camera and clearly showed all the details a real gun would have. I could finally see the glossiness of the gun's metal and was really impressed with the realism of the gun. It must have been some sort of movie-level prop. Despite all this, I never in my wildest dreams considered the possibility that these would be real guns. He then stuck the gun to his head and closed his eyes, slowly pulling on the trigger. The gun just made a click. At this point, I was 100% sure that these were either really good fakes or they were all empty real ones. I was eager to pick the next gun, desperate to show the man that I didn't fall for his stupid prank. We then repeated the process. He asked me to pick one gun, and I picked the one in the middle this time. He then started to shake like a leaf. He put the gun up to his head, but this time, it was a lot different. He was still quivering, and he seemed like he wanted to try and put the gun down for a second. He was hesitating to pull the trigger. It took him around 2 minutes to finally gather the courage. I didn't even blink or flinch at this time. I was just amazed at the man's acting. His shakes and quivers looked almost genuine. But then, it happened. He pulled the trigger, and I could see his head blowing off with a lot of blood spraying around the room. A few drops sprayed on the camera. This thankfully blurred the horrible sight of whatever remained of his lower head. But even through the blood, I could see his muscles start to twitch and spasm. After a few more seconds, they stopped moving. I immediately looked away from my computer and closed my eyes. I kept telling myself that there was no way this could be real, but I was starting to believe that he wasn't pretending. The blood looked too real, and there was no way this man could have faked blowing his head off. This looked more realistic than AAA movies. This couldn't have been an edit. It had to be real. I kept closing my eyes and opening them a few times to see if his body was still there. My anxiety attack was at its peak. Part of me was just waiting for the man to start moving again, hoping it was some sort of 3D animation. The other was facing reality. But his body never moved. I decided to stay on the page as long as I can to see if the body will at least shift a little. Maybe someone from his house will enter the room and quickly rush him to a hospital. I was devastated, but at this point, I started to feel sick to my stomach. I rushed to the bathroom and started throwing up. I passed a good 20 minutes before I came back into my room, slowly opening my laptop. I really hoped it was only just hallucinations or something, maybe a dream. I just wanted to wake up from this nightmare. But then it hit me. I just witnessed someone taking their own life. When I looked back at the screen with horror, the image was still the same. He couldn't be pretending this long. Now I knew for sure that this couldn't be a prank. I came across the idea that I could yell into my microphone or maybe alarm someone at his apartment or house. Try and unmute myself and see if that'd do anything. Maybe someone was around and could help him. But unfortunately, in my panic, I clicked on the wrong button. This instantly closed the chat window with the man. I tried to reopen Omegle, but at this point, Omegle already assigned me a new stranger. I decided to try and just somehow sleep, hopefully erasing it from my memory. I obviously couldn't do this. I couldn't help the man anyways. I didn't know his name or location. After about a week, I buried the memory deep in the back of my mind. I never told my parents. I never told anyone for that matter. I was just too ashamed, too afraid, too embarrassed. I still occasionally think about the incident after 4 years. Maybe if I just believed him, maybe if I just listened to him, I could have somehow talked him out of it. But I can't change the past. I need to try and forget about this. There's nothing I can do. People often ask me why I'm so paranoid about going online, especially in this day and age. What I'm about to tell you should answer that perfectly. This story took place around 3 years ago. I still feel surreal talking about it. The whole ordeal felt like it happened over a blur, but I can somehow remember it to the smallest details. It was a Friday night, and while I normally would be with some friends, I instead found myself at home. It was an odd time of year. My friends seemed to be either busy or sick. This wasn't also terrible though. I do occasionally enjoy having some time to myself, and it was a good time to sort of just relax on my computer. I naturally hopped on my computer and started surfing the web. It wasn't productive, but it did help me unwind a lot. After an hour or two, however, my boredom started to take its peak. I was running out of things to do, websites to go on, but I recalled a website my friends and I used to go on a while back. Omegle had been around for a good time now, but I hadn't gone on it in a while. I felt the whole concept was a bit silly at my age, but with all of this, my boredom was getting to me. I said hell with it and decided to open a new tab. I opened Omegle, and to my expectations, nothing much had changed at all. It was the usual meet random people via text or video. It didn't really have the same thrill, quote unquote, as a few years ago, but I'm not 100% sure why. After scrolling through some people, however, I was in all honesty still bored. But as I was about to hit escape, I was greeted by a man. The man had an almost infectious smile. His teeth were almost completely showing, and it honestly threw me off guard at first. Needless to say, he seemed really happy about something, and this intrigued me for whatever reason. Not only was I trying to not ruin this man's extremely good mood, I genuinely found it interesting seeing a smile like that these days. Most people just seem so unhappy. "What's up, man?" I politely said, trying to match the man's energy. There was a slight pause in our interaction, and then the smiling man then said in a cool and alluring voice, "Why, hello there, stranger. Normally I'd ask how you're doing, but you seem like you're having a great day," I replied jokingly. The man chuckled to himself and continued, "Life is too short to be unhappy. You never know when things could take a turn. Is it worth looking back and only remembering yourself frowning?" That took a rather deep turn, but I suppose the guy was right. There's no point in sulking constantly. "Now, would you like to meet a friend?" the man abruptly said. Sure, I guess," I replied. The smiling man then brought out a person in a mask. The person seemed tall and skinny, and the mask was a blank white one. The only thing I could see on the masked person was part of their eyes. But that wasn't even the scary part. The person in the mask seemed awfully limp, essentially the opposite of the smiling man. "Now, there's no need to be afraid," the smiling man said, acknowledging the shock on my face. "Is this some sort of sick joke?" I asked. "Now that's no way to treat someone you've just met now, is it?" the man said, still with a smile burnt on his face. I remained silent. Part of me wanted to believe that this was some sort of prank. But when the man's smile turned from happiness to a sick grin, I knew something sinister was happening. My fear turned into irritation as the man kept smiling and holding this limp person on the screen. I took several screenshots and told the man to give up this sick prank or else I'd report him as a nuisance to the police. But the man just kept smiling. Just as my hand was going to the escape button, the man stopped me. "Not so fast." "Are you really gonna try and talk your way out of this?" I asked the man angrily. The man continued with his crazed smile and put a piece of paper up to the screen. It was blurry at first, but I wiped my monitor and let his webcam refocus. I was in shock. My face went pale as I read the paper once again. It was my address. A shiver went up my spine. My adrenaline was pumping. I had no idea what to do next. Should I keep stalling him? Will the police even arrive in time? The man just started chuckling and giggling to himself. I quickly unplugged my computer and surveyed my room. I sprinted down the stairs and confirmed my front and back doors were locked. Some of my blinds were open, but there was no point in running to close them. I had no time to spare. For all I knew, my address could have been leaked for that whole entire conversation. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen and ran to the nearest bathroom. I threw whatever chair I had against the bathroom door and tried to block it closed. Things just kept going downhill from there. I grabbed my phone and called the police. The emergency operator told me that the police were caught up in other things as it was late on a Friday night, but they would try and send a unit my way as soon as possible due to the nature of the emergency. But while the operator was on the phone with me, I heard my back gate fling open. That gate was never used. It always remained locked. I asked the operator whether the cops had arrived at my house yet. She said the nearest unit was still about 5 to 10 minutes away. I then heard footsteps approaching my backyard. I knew I had one chance. It wouldn't take long for whoever this was to get into my house and eventually find me. I pondered my options for a second, but eventually came to a decision. I opened the bathroom window and leaped out of it. I landed in the least graceful way possible. The crunches of the leaves under my feet would definitely have alerted the intruder. It was now or never. I ran faster than I had ever had, the chills and shivers up my spine only fueling my stamina. I eventually jumped over my fence and onto the street. I ran towards the main road as fast as I could. My more logical side told me that I should have at least looked back to see if they came alone or how they even arrived at my house, but there was no going back now. After what seemed like several minutes of frantic sprinting, I finally arrived at an intersection. There were obviously no cars or people at this time at night, but at least it was in front of a traffic light with cameras and street lamps. I looked back to see if I was being followed, but the coast seemed clear enough. I finally mustered up the courage to walk back to my house and see if the police had arrived. Judging by the sounds of the sirens, they did. I explained to the cops everything that happened when I got there. I even showed them the screenshots. They managed to identify the man as someone who had just gotten out of jail on a petty vandalism charge. They never suspected him of doing anything like this. I asked them about the person in the mask and whether they were okay. They explained it to me, but tried to keep it in a neutral tone. The masked man's dimensions seemed to match up with someone who had gone missing not long ago. They were still unsure of whether the person was unconscious or dead in the video. The smiling man was logging my IP address the whole time. He somehow managed to trace those video packets to my house. The police were still trying to understand whether it was the man himself or someone else who came over to my house. Our exchange was then interrupted by one of the investigators handing us over a piece of paper in an evidence bag. The officer looked just as stumped as I did. "What is it?" I asked. The cop was hesitant to even show it to me at first. "Listen, this is my house, okay? You guys need to show me what you're looking at right now," I replied back angrily. The officer then showed me the piece of paper, and my heart sank. On the paper it read, "Fun meeting you," with a smiley face written at the end of it. When it comes to life, I've always considered myself a rather fortunate person. However, the story I'm about to tell you changed that permanently. I'm a college student, and at the time it was my second year there. I consider myself an unproblematic person. I just sort of do my thing and live a normal lifestyle. I had friends, decent grades, and a few hobbies. I was a really normal person. Knowing all this about myself, however, I never really expected traumatizing things to happen. Ordinary people like me usually don't attract negative attention or drama. It was the weekend after finals, and all of us were thrilled. Our semester was long and difficult. We were all ready for a break. My friends and I had just finished congratulating our upperclassmen friends. They were graduating that year. We chilled out with the seniors, said our goodbyes, and went back to my dorm. At the time, my room had a large monitor and speaker set. This meant that my friends and I could often watch videos together online or just do other stuff. This night in particular, however, we wanted to give Omegle a try. Omegle was a weird website. It was either comprised of young kids or old men showing their junk on camera. But sometimes, we met chill people or had some fun trolling weirdos back. In the room was me, my friends Sophia, Lucy, and Emily. We launched Omegle and started scrolling through people. At first, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was just Emily and I scrolling through while Lucy and Sophia were in the background. We met a usual mixture of weirdos and cool people, but it just seemed like another night with the girls. At some point, however, we encountered a rather aged man. He wasn't exactly well groomed and seemed to be in a dingy room. I want to say he was close to 40, but none of this was exactly abnormal. He's just another creepy old man on the internet. The man surveyed his screen and started smiling oddly. "What's with that smile?" we asked. He looked around our room a little more and replied, "Oh, nothing, I'm just killing some time online." At this point, all of us were on the same page. We were all gonna think of weird and sarcastic things to say to him to make him uncomfortable. I mean, after all, Omegle was meant for trolling people. "Nice hair," Sophia remarked sarcastically. The man seemed to have a very, very patchy hair pattern and was mostly bald on his head. "You're a funny young lady," the man replied, "but I'm more focused on what's behind y'all." We looked behind us, and Lucy was in the back. Lucy was a very attractive young woman. Random men hitting on her was something all of us were just too used to at this point. Unalarmed by the man's behavior, We shot back with another sarcastic response. You're interested in what's behind us? You mean the desk? Oh, it's just a regular desk. It came with the dorm. You into tables or something? All of us started laughing at Emily's comment. The man, however, just smirked and continued his thought. You gals are very funny, but I'm talking about the girl to the very back right. All of us just continued to chuckle. Sorry, not interested, Lucy immediately replied, but the man just continued. You're a young woman, you see. You've never had a real man. You don't know what actual romance is, but I can show you. All of us looked at each other blankly, and then burst into laughter. We've all had weird old men hit on us online, but this guy really thinks he has a chance with Lucy. When we looked back at the screen, the man looked furious. His initial smirk was completely gone. You girls never understand, will you? The man exclaimed. This just somehow fueled our laughter, and fueled the man's rage even more. He started going on about teaching her a lesson and making sure we understood he was serious. At this point, we were done messing with the man. We skipped to the next person, thinking about what a sore loser he was. We've met weirdos before, but this guy really couldn't handle rejection from some girl online. The next day came, and I got a call from Emily. Apparently there was a pretty decent-sized party commemorating the end of the year. It took place the night before move-out day as usual, and it seemed to be catching a lot of traction on social media. But this one was a bit different. Normally, students would find some sort of house or dorm to host these parties, but the past few parties which have been doing this have got the police called on them pretty quickly, so when the cops show up, the party shuts down. In order to prevent this, they were going to have a party in the woods, at a nearby campsite most likely. As sketchy as this seems, this wasn't actually abnormal at our university. My college is near a rather famous set of campsites. It's kind of close to the woods, and it was actually common for people to bring some lights and a speaker to the hiking trails away from the city to have parties. It was a great way of avoiding noise complaints and avoiding police. And considering this party was spreading through social media like a wildfire, we knew that there'd be a lot of other people there, so really nothing to worry about. Knowing that this had been done before, Lucy, Sophia, Emily, and I quickly got ready for the party. We kept laughing at the man from before. We messed with people all the time online, but his reaction was just priceless. We drove down to the forest and headed on the trail. It was late at night, but there was a lot of other people. We eventually got to the campsite, and there was already a fire going in one of the pits. There were a lot of people there, and music was already blasting. We all went in and started talking to people. Lucy broke off first, and met up with a man. He was tall and wore a gray sweater. The guy was pretty cute, and I trusted Lucy's instincts to be safe. After all, we were surrounded by a lot of people. There was nothing much the guy could do. As the rest of us ventured through the party, we split up a little and started to really lay back. I ended up talking to this cute guy. He went by Joey, and he overall seemed chill. We eventually exchanged numbers and socials. As the night raged on, it started to get late. I started to gather everyone back up so we could head back to our apartment. I didn't want to get there the next morning or anything. I got a hold of Sophie, and then Emily shortly after, but Lucy, she was nowhere to be found. I asked Joey if he'd seen her, but he had no clue where she was. Several more minutes go by of us looking through the party, and we still just couldn't find her. We tried texting and calling her various times, but her phone consistently went to voicemail. This was odd. Lucy would always consistently pick up, especially when it was us. We scrambled around even more, and there was still no sign of her. Things were starting to get actually scary. It was considerably late, and people were starting to leave the party, but despite the lower amount of people, we still couldn't get a hold of Lucy. I tried to keep calm, but Sophie and Emily were really starting to freak out. We wanted to assume that she'd gone to some dude's house, but that still didn't explain her not picking up the phone. After looking around the forest and asking people around a bit more, we still had no sign of her. I even tried contacting her other friends to see if she'd been back on campus, but from what they said, it really didn't seem like it. Sophie, Emily, and I reluctantly walked back to our car. We wanted to see if she was at least waiting for us there, but to our horror, she was not there either. We really didn't want to call the cops either, especially considering that we'd be snitching on ourselves for the party. but we honestly felt we were running out of options. In the end of the day, Lucy had mysteriously disappeared and was last spotted in the woods. This in itself sounded terrifying, and we needed help. I was the most sober, so I dropped Sophie and Emily back at the university and drove over to the police station. I filed a report at the police station, and during this time, Emily continued to search for Lucy at the university. As I told the police more and more of what happened, they started to realize that this could be serious. It deemed probable enough cause to start a full-on search for Lucy. There was nothing I could do, so I met back up with Sophie and Emily at the university. We tried our best to go to sleep. That next day, I got a call from the station. I frantically picked up to see if they had any news. I wanted to see where our friend was. What could have happened to her? Let's just say, my heart sank. Lucy was found dead in the woods with multiple stab wounds lathered across her body. Her body was found not far at all from the forest party. Police believe that she could have been dragged out in the woods in the dark, her screams muffled by the loud music and people. Sophie began to sob, and Emily and I just stood there, our faces pale with disbelief. The cops still hadn't found the culprit, but I felt I had a clue. I remember Lucy flirting with that tall man. I felt it had to be him. Another horrid day went by, and eventually I was asked to step into the station for a bit more questioning. It turns out they think they found their culprit. I was enraged. I was about to see the person that took my friend from me permanently. It hit me that I may or may not have been going to school with this man the whole time. That thought disgusted me, but somehow it was even worse than I thought. When they brought out the killer, it was the old man from Omegle. How did this man find us? How was any of this even happening? But that's when it struck me. During the Omegle call, Lucy had a name tag on from an event she attended prior. She was also wearing our school's sweatshirt. The cops believe the man managed to find her on social media and track down the party we were going to. He seems to have tracked down who liked and commented on the post, and surely Lucy did both of which. Rage and despair filled me from my feet to my head. This creep online who he messed with, he really lived up to his threats. I didn't even get to say goodbye to Lucy. I couldn't believe it. If there's anything I want you guys to get out of this, it's to be careful who you meet and what you share online. Unimaginable things can still happen.
Back when I was in community college, I worked at this pizza place that was basically in the middle of nowhere. It was located in a strip mall at the side of a highway in a pretty rural area, and there were just people dotted around the surrounded area that the store never quite went out of business. But since we hardly made any money, we operated a skeleton crew at all hours, and especially late at night. Sometimes it would just be 2 people in the store, me and one other guy. One would make the pies, and the other would drive them out to the customers. It wasn't always a perfect system, but we managed. Without a doubt, the best time to work was Wednesday or Thursday nights, simply because of how quiet it was. You worked a Wednesday or Thursday late shift and basically got paid to sit around on your butt and talk trash with your coworker. You'd maybe get 1 or 2 calls, nothing stressful, and that was that. But this one night, we get a call almost bang on 11 p.m., a half hour before closing. Any other time, we might actually be kinda angry, but it was just way too out of the ordinary for us to even be mad. Like, I think it was legit the first time we'd ever gotten a call that late. Now, at the time, my coworker is out in his car having a quick smoke before we start our clean down, so I'm all on my own when I hear the phone. Part of me was like, just don't answer it, dude. But honestly, curiosity got the best of me. Most of the families in the county work their farms, so they go to bed pretty early in the evening, so who was calling so late? When I pick up, I don't recognize the voice on the end. Given the nature of the job, I pretty much know everyone who calls, along with exactly what they're going to order. But still, it's not entirely unusual that we get someone new calling. But what was really unusual was how this guy's order differed from most others, not to mention how he was acting in general. So right off the bat, I can tell there's something not quite right with the guy. His voice was super raspy, like he lived in a whiskey still and smoked Marlboros for breakfast. and I know it's about to be a weird call when the first thing he asks for is a hamburger. I'm like, "Sir, this is a pizza place. I can read you our menu if you like." Which was no problem. We only had like 6 different pizzas with a couple of sides. The guy says it's fine. All he wants is hamburger meat. I'm assuming he meant on a pizza since we did actually do a cheeseburger pizza at the time, so I asked some clarification. But no, this guy doesn't want a pizza. He just wants hamburger meat. Raw hamburger meat. I don't even know if I'm allowed to sell raw hamburger meat. Like, I know you can eat raw hamburger meat. Like, I'm pretty sure that's what steak tartare is, but I figured there had to be some kind of food hygiene law against it. I asked my coworker, who was way too blazed to give me a solid answer, so I give the guy an honest answer and tell him I'm not even sure I'm allowed to sell him raw hamburger. The guy started begging and pleading so hard that I was actually speechless for a moment. He sounded like he was fiending for it, so bad that it was actually kind of creepy. I'm even less sure about the whole thing by that point, but after the guy on the phone offers a handsome tip, I make an executive decision and decided to go ahead with the sale. People do dumb stuff for money, right? Well, I suppose this is my thing. I throw what I consider to be $10 retail worth of hamburger meat into a plastic carton, plug this guy's address into my navigation system, then began the drive out to his house. I've been making deliveries in that area of Lawrence County for about 18 months at that time. I'm not saying I knew the place like the back of my hand, but I'd certainly never seen this guy's house before. I didn't even know that old place was there. It was some old farmhouse at the end of a long dirt road, and it looked like it was falling apart. It would have made a great haunted house, and all I could think as my headlights suddenly lit the whole place up was that it was like the start of a horror movie or something. I was the poor, dumb pizza boy, doomed to die in the film's intro that introduced whatever crazed killer or monstrous creature that was the movie's main feature. I park up, walk up the old rickety porch, and since there was no sign of a doorbell, I just knock on this guy's door. When he answers, he actually looks pretty normal. Like he'd expect some decrepit old witch to answer the door to a house like that. Not a guy in a sweater vest who looked like the dad of all dads. As I'm handing over the bag of hamburger meat, I can't resist asking him why he'd ordered raw hamburger and not an actual menu item. I figured he's going to grill it at home or whatever, so I frame my question as such. But the guy just smiles, shakes his head, and tells me he's going to eat it raw. I must have completely failed to hide the look of disgusted confusion on my face, because the guy then launches into this big speech about the benefits of eating raw meat. I mean, he talked a lot of science terms that I didn't understand, but he seemed to know what he was talking about, and it actually weirdly put me at ease for a second as he fished around his wallet for a tip. He hands me $11 in crumpled ones, and as I count them, I'm like, "Thanks, man. That's really generous." But then I look up, just in time to see the guy crack the lid on the plastic container of meat, bring it up to his nose, and take a long, deep sniff of what was inside. The way he acted wasn't like this wholesome, smells yummy kind of happy. It seemed straight up perverse. I'm just watching, trying not to freak out, as the smell of the meat seems to legit turn him on. After he huffs it, he shudders, eyes rolling in their sockets before he gets this glazed look in them, and all I'm thinking is, this is my cue to leave. I awkwardly thank the guy, just happy to get off of his property, only right as I go to turn around and walk back off the porch, I see something moving in the dimly lit hallway over the dude's shoulder. Poking out at about waist height from behind a doorframe was this big pair of terrified eyes looking back at me from sunken sockets. It was a kid. I don't even know what compelled me to ask, but whatever it was so strong that it overrode any desire I had to flee while I still had the legs to carry me. I remember saying something like, "That your kid, huh?" Instead of giving me this big smile or waxing lyrical about what a proud dad they were, something that would have suited his wholesome sweater vest dad look, he suddenly looks furious. He spins around on the spot. The kid looks terrified and disappears from view. Then, when he turns back, he just stares at me, this deep, moody stare that sent a shiver down my spine. And once again, I get that overwhelming "this is my cue to leave" feeling. I thank the guy, backing off the porch in a way where I never quite turn my back on him. He doesn't say a word in response, just keeps that angry look on his face, like I'd done something to offend him or seen something I shouldn't have. It took 20 minutes to drive back to the pizza place. 20 long minutes I had to replay the interaction in my head over and over again. I called 911 as soon as I got back. Like I had no idea what was going on back there, but it couldn't have been good. No kid should be that scared of their dad, if that guy even was that kid's dad at all. My logic was that I could call 911, find out I just came out at a bad time and took the dude's actions out of context and maybe feel a little embarrassed. Or find out that something horrible was happening in that house, feel horrendous guilt that I failed to stop it, and then be haunted for the rest of my life. Though what I wasn't expecting was that there was actually a third option, one that turned out to be worse than the first two. So, I call the cops. They go to check it out. Then the deputy gets back in touch to reassure me that he'd been over to the guy's house, had a good look around, and then found that there was nothing wrong. I figured that once a cop had told me that, I'd feel fine. Kind of stupid for assuming stuff, but generally fine. But I didn't. I found myself just not believing the guy. Like he couldn't have seen the same stuff that I had and just walked away being like, yeah, it's all good in that house. I didn't do another delivery to that house for the rest of the time I worked there, and I certainly wasn't complaining about not having to make any more weird deliveries. But even today, I find myself wondering what the deal was with that guy and his kid, and whether or not I should have done more to investigate. Because the thing that haunts me the most is that there might be some kind of kid out there going through the most horrifying ordeal of their young lives, thinking like, why didn't that man help me? Why didn't that man help me? So I'm pretty sure there are identical services in America, but over here in England, you can get your supermarket of choice to deliver your shopping or groceries directly to your home. After you make your order, some hard-working, handsome, diligent driver person will load your food into a van, drive it out to you, and personally deliver them with a smile. And if you're lucky enough to live in Nottingham, then that handsome driver person might well be me. Since the whole pandemic thing started, the number of people using Asda's delivery service has shot up. In the run-up to Christmas, I worked 8 days straight, from 7 in the morning to 8 in the evening with hardly any kind of break to keep me sane. It was exhausting, completely and utterly exhausting, and that's the insane level of fatigue I was feeling that takes the blame for the story I have for you today. So, as I'm making quite a large delivery one night, and the roads are pretty quiet, I see blue flashing lights in my rearview mirror. I give it a few seconds and the lights are still behind me, so obviously I pull over to the side of the road to await further instructions. It's about then that I realize that it's not a normal looking police car. It's unmarked, just this plain looking Renault Clio, and the guy that got out of the driver's side was wearing just regular civilian clothes. I lower my window to see the guy flashing a badge and an ID at me, but he's wearing a face mask for COVID, so it's not like I can see who it actually is anyway. But when the guy says drug squad and asks for my driver's license, I obviously comply. Undercover police are a thing after all, and a city like Nottingham has a lot of drug crimes, so I didn't think anything of the guy being in his own clothes. The guy runs a check on my ID, then explains that a big drug gang has been using professional couriers to ferry product around, and that he and his partner might need to search my rear storage. Obviously, I tell them I'll do anything I can to help, so I mask up, get out of the cab, and open up the rear storage of my van so the police can look around. As soon as the rear doors are open, I notice that the plainclothes officer who climbs into the back is being really rough with some of the produce. I don't say anything at first. I wouldn't dare start lecturing a policeman on how to do his job, especially when they were hot on the tail of some drug gang and seemed pretty agitated about it. His partner then asked me if he can search the cab of my van, so I open it up for him, and he too starts rummaging around the glove box and stuff, being just as rough and inconsiderate as the officer in the back. Again, I'm quite annoyed by this, and I wander around the back of the van to see how things are getting on, only to find the officer searching back there is in the process of basically ransacking the contents. He's shoving things off shelves, tossing fragile items out the back door. It was outrageous behavior. I finally find it in me to speak up and ask the officer in quite a loud but polite tone to please not be so rough with the produce. "Shut your mouth," was all he said in reply, without skipping a beat too. It was such a rude response that I was actually a little bit dumbstruck for a second. I dealt with some impatient police officers before, but this was something else entirely. I tell him there's no need for that kind of attitude, as I am being perfectly cooperative. But by that point, his colleague has joined me after searching the cab and decides to play the good side of this good cop, bad cop routine. He apologizes for the inconvenience, assures me of the importance of their work, and then says that he has to search me too, since I might be hiding something on me. By then, I was already late for my scheduled delivery, so that ship had sailed, so I figured I might as well just be a good little citizen and continue to help the police as much as I could. So then right there, parked up on a dark, deserted street, this masked-up officer starts frisking my pants and jacket for anything I should have on me. It was just like a routine stop and search at first, nothing out of the ordinary, but then the bloke asked me to take off my jacket so he can search it more thoroughly. Bear in mind, it's absolutely freezing out, so I'm not best pleased, but I still comply. He pats it down a bit, tosses it to the side, then tells me to take off my shoes. I shoot him this confused look, and he starts telling me how I could easily hide drugs or money inside my footwear. I'm coming to the end of my tether, but I do as I'm told, and that's when it all goes downhill. The police officer has my shoes in my hands. He walks around the back of me and starts putting me in cuffs. He tries to assure me that I'm just being detained and I'll be uncuffed once the search is completed, but his explanation does nothing for my nerves. I feel trapped. I'm starting to panic, and I'm starting to realize that something is horribly wrong with this whole encounter. I'm freezing. I got no shoes on. This police officer is leaning me back towards the van, and I'm just on the verge of kicking off. And then right as I say something about getting their badge numbers to make a complaint, the officer escorting me back towards the van shoves me to the ground and says something like, "Were you bollocks, mate?" I couldn't believe what was happening. Or maybe it was just that I didn't want to believe what was happening. Because as I get dragged back to my feet by an officer who has suddenly lost all airs of professionalism, it dawns on me that these two policemen aren't exactly who they say they are. And that's when the raw fear kicked in. Like I said, I'm handcuffed, freezing and shoeless, completely at these blokes' mercy, and to make matters worse, they start asking me questions that they're not liking the answers to. They start asking me where the money is, and I don't realize what they're asking for at first. And as if they still thought I was some kind of drug courier or something to that effect, I'm telling them that I don't know what they're talking about, that it's all online these days and there's no cash in the van. They responded by throwing me into the refrigerated rear storage unit, threatening to lock the doors behind them. Now, most delivery drivers who have these kinds of cold storage have the means to unlock the door, should they ever get trapped inside. But I'm handcuffed, and my jacket with the keys in it is just lying at the side of the road. If they'd shut the doors on me, I might not be around to tell this story. I beg them not to shut the doors, and I know how pathetic I must have sounded because they just responded by bursting out laughing at me, mimicking my pleading in a horrifying display of cruelty and viciousness. They responded by pulling me out of the unit, me hitting the tarmac so hard I think I dislocated my shoulder, before absolutely kicking the life out of me as I was laying there groaning. It was hands down the most terrifying few minutes of my life, and now that I look back on it, I think that's exactly what they wanted. I mean, why rob a bloody supermarket delivery truck? I'm not exactly an armored bank car, am I? They weren't stupid blokes either. The one I spoke to the most had this way about him, really made me think he was a legit policeman, you know? So why target me? Simple. Because they knew I could be easily intimidated. I was a soft target, one that they could just toy with to get their rocks off. They could just pull over some bloke in a Beamer, take all his cash, or maybe an electrical truck or something if they wanted to make some money. But me, I wasn't work. I was pleasure. They did what they did that evening because it was fun for them. And honestly, that's what scares me the most. The creation of apps like Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Postmates marked the dawn of a new age in food delivery services. 10 years ago, pink-eyed teenagers everywhere envisioned a day when they could get McDonald's delivered to their smoky apartment doors. Yet now, what was nothing more than a Munchies-induced fantasy has become a concrete reality, creating new means of employment as well as satisfying appetites all over the country. For one of these newly employed delivery drivers, Sonia King, a DoorDash driver's account gave her the ability to plan her work around her busy home life. She could log on during a public holiday, Cinco de Mayo for example, and watch the cash roll in as she delivered tacos, burritos, and enchiladas all over the city of Atlanta, Georgia. But little did Sonia know that the first job of the day would be her last, and would involve a brush with death that left her shaken and traumatized. The 31-year-old mother of 4 was making a routine delivery at the time of the incident and hadn't previously encountered any kind of trouble while she was on the job. But on that particular occasion, she got out of her car, grabbed the food delivery from her passenger seat, only to find herself face to face with a man by the name of Rick Painter. Sonia said that at first, Rick seemed like a perfectly normal guy. He had requested the food delivery be dropped off on a counter inside of his house, which was an unusual request, but one Sonia had no problem adhering to. Some disabled customers have special requests they make of delivery drivers, who are often only too happy to accommodate them. Besides, the house looked perfectly well maintained and non-threatening, and as Sonia later put it, anyone would have gone inside. But when she entered the house, and it came to Rick giving her a tip, Sonia found that her customer was anything but normal. As Rick thanked Sonia for dropping the food off and pulled out a $5 bill from his wallet, he looked her up and said, "Oh, by the way, I'm Jesus." Sonia was thrown off guard by this bizarre comment, and it took a moment for it to register that it was what he actually said. But when the penny dropped that this apparently perfectly normal guy was comparing himself to a prophet, Sonia began to get nervous. She says Rick then shot her a look that gave away how horribly unhinged he was, a kind of predatory smile that sent shivers down her spine, and she knew it was time for her to leave. Only Rick wasn't about to let her leave, as he had other things in mind for her. At this point, it's important to note that Sonia is a practicing Muslim and wears the full face covering more commonly known as a niqab. Whether or not it was the visual cue to set Rick off and made him allude to himself as Jesus, we can't possibly speculate, but the fact of the matter is that when Rick decided to attack the terrified Sonia, he chose to do so in the most disrespectful way possible. He pulled her niqab from her head, wrapped it around her throat, and began choking her with it. He then grabbed Sonia by the hair and tried to use his grip to apply even more force to her throat. He's grabbing me and trying to choke me with my own niqab. I kept telling the man I've got kids. In the midst of me fighting him, he's grabbing my head, Sonia later said. He thought he was Jesus, but Jesus wouldn't do that to nobody. I was just rolling around and trying to pry off certain fingers, but he would not let my hair go, she continued. I stuck my finger in his eye. He would not let my hair go. It was definitely about to be a murder, and it was going to be me. As Sonia fought for her life, she found she was able to get a grip of her car keys and began using them to jab them into Rick Painter's face over and over again. I didn't want to stab anybody, she insisted, but I had to do it because I kept seeing my kids flashing before my eyes, and I kept seeing my husband and thinking, I gotta get out of this house so I can go home to my family. Time and time again, the sharp ends of Sonia's car keys ripped into Rick's flesh, and his mugshot photo shows him with some seriously horrifying injuries, all inflicted by Sonia. They look incredibly painful and must have been agony to endure at the time of the attack, but disturbingly, Rick seemed to react in a completely different way to what we might expect. Instead of yelling or growling in pain as he was being repeatedly stabbed in the face, Rick began to make noises that turned Sonia's blood to ice. It sounded like he was enjoying it, like the pain was doing less than wholesome things for him. Rick let out a long, slow groan before mumbling, "Ah, this feels good." Somehow, Sonia managed to pry a couple of Rick's fingers free from her hair before slipping out from her niqab in a way that allowed her a window of escape. She bolted back to her car, gunned the engine, and drove away from her unexpected brush with death as quickly as she could. It's almost a miracle that she was able to do so with nothing but cuts and bruises, and if her attacker had put a little more planning and precision into the ambush, there's only a slim chance Sonia would have walked out alive. Not long after the attack, Rick Painter was arrested by the Atlanta Police Department, and his detention kicked off legal proceedings that ended in him being given a 2-year prison sentence on charges of false imprisonment and misdemeanor battery. Sonia might have gotten some small measure of justice from the attack, but knowing Rick will be back on the streets in just 2 years is something that terrifies her. I've become very distant with a lot of people that I love now. I don't trust people. I expect the worst to happen, she said. The scary thing is, the harrowing experience that Sonia endured isn't all that rare, as attacks on food delivery drivers have been steadily rising over the past 5 years or so. Delivery drivers in London are finding that their distinctive Uber Eats branded bags and waterproofs are making them a target for robberies. In several violent instances, drivers were knocked off their bikes or mopeds, either by flying kicks or by being hit by a car, before a gang descends on them to relieve the injured party of their valuables. The scale of the problem is hard to assess because police forces don't yet gather statistics on it, and the companies themselves don't publish any. Sonia King personally thinks that DoorDash should do more to protect its 400,000 couriers, such as background checks to identify customers with criminal records. Rick Painter had been in and out of prison for other violent offenses, and Sonia says that if she'd known that, she wouldn't have been so quick to take the job. She also complains that after the attack, she wasn't able to speak to anyone from the San Francisco company. She could only email them, and that it was 3 days before anyone actually called to check on her. "I almost died, and this is the way they treat me," she added. "It was just disgusting." DoorDash says it sincerely regrets the handling of Sonia's case, that they take the safety of their drivers extremely seriously and do not tolerate any form of harassment or inappropriate behavior. DoorDash added that it has now introduced a free occupational accident insurance policy for all of its U.S. drivers, but for some, the move is too little, too late. But despite all we do to ensure the safety and security of our fellow man, what we can't prevent is certain individuals' twisted desire to hunt and hurt perfectly innocent people. People who abuse the ever-growing service economy to prey on those desperate to make a living. People like that will always find a way to slip through the net, and the horrifying fact is that, no matter what we do, we'll never be completely safe, no matter where we are or what we're doing. So, I had this part-time job when I was in high school, working as a pizza delivery driver for a large pizza chain. I saw some pretty wild stuff on the job, but only one thing that actually seriously creeped me out. I'm making this routine delivery to some innocuous-looking house, but when the guy answers the door, he just sort of grabs the pizza, thrusts a fistful of ones in my face, then slams the door behind him. At first, I'm just like, rude. But then when I count the money, I find that not only has this guy not given me enough for his 20-inch meat lovers, but he's not even bothered to tip me. I'd been burned once or twice before when it came to my count, and the difference ended up coming out of my wages, so I was not about to let that nonsense happen a third time. I ended up banging on the guy's door for like a solid 5 minutes before he answered. Like I could see him moving around behind the frosted glass panel, but totally ignoring my knocking. In the end, I lose my temper and say something like, "Hey man, don't try and finesse me out of money. I don't want to have to call the cops, but I will." Boom. Those were the magic words. He comes right up to the front door and opens it up. Not all the way, maybe a third of the way open. This guy is saying sorry a whole lot. Like almost too much. He's all pale, he's sweating, his hands are shaking as he passes me out a 20, just laying the sorry the whole time. I'm just thinking, what's this guy's problem? But then I catch a glimpse of something in the hallway behind the guy, and suddenly I've got a good idea what the guy's deal was. There's a dark red stain on the wooden floor, maybe the size of a manhole cover, and next to it are what look like all kinds of different cleaning products. I take one quick look at that, then at the guy, and he just slams the door in my face. I'm back in my car and speeding back to the pizza place faster than you can say F that. As soon as I get there, I call the cops. As it turned out, I had legit interrupted this guy cleaning up a murder. And from what I heard, the guy was having an affair with a high school girl that was like 30 years his junior. She's over at his place while his wife is out of town, orders pizza at some point, then before it even arrives, the guy kills her because she's threatening to ruin his marriage or something. He had no clue that she'd ordered the pie, panics when I show up at the door, and that's how he got caught. Crazy story, right? But for me, the craziest part isn't so much the whole murderous infidelity thing. It's that before she was murdered, this girl unwittingly kicked off a chain of events that would catch her own killer. I had to go to court a bunch of times too, since I was basically the case's star witness, and it was so freaky seeing that guy looking at me when I talked to the prosecutor. He'd literally killed a girl with his own hands, and there he was, giving me death stares. Like I said, I've seen some wild stuff working pizza delivery, but only one thing that gave me nightmares. That guy's eyes.